Okay. How's everybody's weekend?
Pretty uneventful.
I got almost another bedroom listed. I've been working on that most of the weekend.
Uh-huh. All right, so we finished up with lesson 1 last week, and we kind of blew through that pretty quick. I'm sure as you saw, a lot of those lessons were very, fairly simple, right? Especially given like what we did with 1.3 and 1.4. There's barely anything there. So what we're going to get into today, we're going to go over lesson 2.1 today, 2.2 on Wednesday, and then 2.3 on Friday. I know, unfortunately, that doesn't leave us a whole lot of time for labs with 2.3, but that just kind of is where it is, where the calendar falls. So that's kind of giving some more space for us to dive into this material a little bit deeper. Today with 2.1, we'll be talking more about activities and giving you an intro to something called an intent and talking about the activity life cycle a bit. So the things that we talk about today are really going to carry us through and be really fundamental for what we do throughout the rest of the semester. You're going to see just a hint of a few things today that we'll dive deeper into on Wednesday and Friday. So we're kind of, there are some details that we'll kind of skim over and then go deeper on the rest of the week as far as that goes. So the main focus for this week overall, though, is talking about activities and intents. Those are kind of the two big topics for this week. Now that we've kind of gone through that initial set of labs and you've kind of got oriented with how Android Studio works, at least in its current version, I'm going to actually have you go do the code labs yourself from here on out. So I'll still do a practical example here today, but it won't be the code lab. So I'll expect you to go do the code lab afterward. Cool?
Yep.
Good news is you have today and tomorrow to work on that. Okay, so jumping over to perusal. So we'll be looking at the 2.1 slides today, and obviously you'll want to go read the chapter as well that goes along with that. I have put a few comments in there already, but I'm sure more discussions will come up as we go through. All right. So I'm going to jump into the slides. Okay, so as I kind of already mentioned, the topic for today is activities and intents. So intents we haven't looked at yet. You haven't seen this concept yet, but it'll be a really fundamental one as we move forward. Does anybody could remember what's the definition, though, of an activity? What definition have you already been given for what an activity is?
Say it's something initiated by a user.
I wouldn't define it that way. I'm thinking in the Android definition of the term. Not the English definition, the Android definition.
It's like a page of your app.
It's a page or a screen, right? So typically every screen in your app, there'll be kind of a one-to-one relationship between screens and activities. Now that's not entirely true because obviously activities are a little bit more dynamic. So you may have an activity that appears in multiple places and maybe different forms. But the base understanding is that, the relationship between activities and screens is one-to-one. So if you have 5 screens, you're probably going to have 5 activities. Cool? So what we're going to talk about today, intents is in there as well. We'll kind of explain that term as we get there. So we'll be talking about activities. We'll kind of define a little bit more of maybe what an activity is. We'll talk about how you start a new activity using an intent, and there we'll talk more about what an intent is. It is kind of an abstract term, and that will expand more in later chapters is what we can use that for. Then we'll also talk about how we can pass data around between our activities. Because once you start getting more than one activity, you usually need some methods and some tools to get data from one to the other. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of static activities that really you can do very, very little with. So do pay attention to the part about passing data around. That's one of the things that's covered in this chapter. And unfortunately, they kind of put it on the sidelines as far as passing data around over the next few chapters. So do keep that refreshed. Do make some notes on that kind of thing about how to pass the data around. Because I do know as far as Unit 2 is concerned, there's some gaps where, we get into a lot of other topics. That may be something you forget about because we're not doing it as much. But it is really, really important, and for sure, you can expect that most, if not all, of your hands-on test will need material that's learned from this chapter, because pretty much any app you write is going to have multiple screens and is going to have data that needs to go between those screens. Okay. And then finally, we'll talk about how to some of the ways that you can navigate around in between activities in Android.
All right. It's more straightforward than Node, then.
What do you mean more straightforward?
I guess easier.
That's easier is always a subjective term, right?
Okay. All right. I'll just wait and see.
That's a subjective thing. All right. So let's get into kind of talking about activities from a high level. So an activity isn't one of the application components. You'll kind of remember that there are other application components, which we'll talk about later, namely services and broadcast receivers. We'll talk about those later. Those actually also tie in with intents. An activity basically represents a single window. I would say more screen, and it could be a hierarchy of views. Now, the problem with defining it as a hierarchy of views is that's the same definition of view group. A view group is a hierarchy of views. So I'd rather say is an activity is a single screen, and the idea of the activity is that it should be focused on doing just one thing. That's part of the design philosophy in Android, is that any screen you have should be focused fairly narrowly on what it does. And that comes out of the fact that, if you're looking at a mobile device, and especially a smartphone, the screen's pretty small. So there is a very well-defined limit as to what you can actually put on that single screen. So whereas you might be looking, if you look at desktop UIs and websites that are built for desktop, you're probably going to find a lot of different tasks that you can do on a single page. That's kind of normal in the desktop world, is that you can do a lot of things on one page because you have so much screen real estate. But because the screen real estate is really limited here, you tend to have to break things down into a lot more screens than you might be used to in the desktop world, with much finer focus. So that's a thing to keep in mind. So as far as activities go, any activity is only going to have, there's going to be one activity file for that activity, and that represents basically the logic behind it, of how the business rules and logic behind how that activity works, and maybe interacts with your data or interacts with your database or however else you may be storing or retrieving data. So you can kind of think of it as a container for your business logic, whereas the layout is the actual UI. And in general, your activity should actually know as little as possible about the UI. You are going to, obviously have to know some things. Say if you want to disable or enable button, or know you want to pull the text out of that field. But you want to keep it as divorced as possible, from that front end. And a lot of that comes out just by using resources, whether it be strings resources or whether it be color resources or layout resources. You generally want to keep the UI in the layout, in the resource space. How does it look to the user, and then keep the business logic in the activity. You may or may not have at some point heard the term model view controller, and that's kind of a well-known way to organize your code for a lot of different systems. And so the idea is the model is where you kind of store your data. The controller is kind of the glue between, and the view is your UI. And the general intent is that your layout and your resources should be the view. It should be where you do the presentation. The activity is your kind of your controller, behaves like that in many ways, where it's gotten most of the business logic and kind of the glue code in between that does your working, but is not necessarily concerned with how the UI is. And then you've got the back end, which is the model, and we'll have some classes that we get further in where we may be storing maybe mixing some classes that kind of represent. You can kind of think of them as representing database tables, maybe in a SQL or other world. So you might have, say, if you're working with a store, you might have a product class or a shopping cart class or an order class or a customer or employee. Those kind of classes would be your model classes, and they would kind of sit behind the activity. Okay. So as far as what does an activity do, remember it's kind of that controller in the middle. And it, represents a thing you can do. So, for instance, you might be ordering groceries or picking an item from the product catalog that's available. You might be sending an email. You might be getting directions. It can be a lot of things. But again, it's usually supposed to be oriented around just a single activity, a single task. But that can be very tricky to define, and it also becomes a tricky definition when you go up to tablet sizes, because oftentimes, while on mobile on a smartphone, you might only be able to do one task on a screen. You might be able to actually do 2 or 3 on that same screen with a 10-inch tablet. So sometimes that definition of an activity should represent a single activity or task doesn't hold up on larger screens, but you want to kind of think about it that way still as the encouragement. But the real concrete definition that sticks is an activity is always a screen. There's a one-to-one relationship between the activity and the screen. So it's anytime things happen with your code, whether users clicks on buttons, they type things into a text box, maybe they try to log in, all that kind of stuff is going to happen within your activity. It's going to happen and take care of your, again, what we call your business logic. You can also use it to start other activities, whether they be in your app. You may start activities that are in your application, but you can actually also start activities that are in other applications. And that's part of what we'll talk about on Friday, is how to use activities that are in other applications.
Mr. Smith, would an example of that be when you would say share a photo that would take it from my gallery app, my photo gallery app, and share it to, say, like Facebook or something?
Yeah, it would be something like that. That's usually a little bit more complicated interaction, because you may have some back and forth. But yeah, that would sharing is always a touch point where you're touching more than one app. You may in fact be touching 3 apps, because you might say, well, I'm in my application and I want to go get a photo from my Photos app, my gallery, and then pull it into my app and then share the post on Facebook. So I might actually be touching the gallery app as well as the Facebook app in that scenario. So there's a little bit more to it than that. But that's one part of that. Another common thing that comes up is if you want to say use the camera oftentimes we will use we'll kind of jump into the camera app, take the picture, and come back. So there's a lot of different ways that may manifest. Every activity has what we call a life cycle. Initially it's what we call created. Later on, shortly thereafter, it becomes started, and then finally it runs. Once it's running is when the user actually sees it. So there's kind of 3 states it has to go through before the user actually sees it, and we'll talk about this more in detail. And then it can also be paused, put on hold because some other app is running. It could be later resumed because the user comes back. It could be stopped. A similar sort of scenario has to do with if they leave the app and come back, or maybe they go to a different screen and come back. And then finally, the activities can be destroyed. Once the activities are destroyed, they never come back. So destroyed is kind of that final state. Once they're destroyed, they're done for. You can't return. You can't get back to them. But created is that initial state, and if you've looked at the code that we've already worked with, you may notice that we've already written this onCreate method. Well, the onCreate method is what gets called when the activity gets created. So that's the first point in the life cycle. So Wednesday we'll talk about more how these different life cycle states and such and the methods involved in them work. So far we've only talked about onCreate. But we'll talk about the rest of those on Wednesday. But keep that in mind. You're going to hear a few mentions of that today. Again, we're not going to go into it too deeply, but you'll hear me mention created and destroyed maybe a few times as we work through this. So examples of activities you might find. We've built the Hello Toast application, so that was a single activity. You might have a food list. Here you can pick from a variety of foods and maybe add it to your order or your shopping cart or whatever it may be. So you might have something like that. You might have the calculator as an activity, or the activity might be, Google Maps and trying to find the path to whatever place is in there. Hyderabad. So you might be finding it to a particular location. So all of those are examples of activities, and an activity can really be almost anything. The one thing it has to be is a screen, for sure. So as we're talking about apps and activities, activities are kind of loosely tied together to build your apps. So there's not an explicit usually explicit dependency between activity A and activity B. In fact, generally your activity should have no knowledge, as little knowledge as possible, or no knowledge of the other activities that exist in your application. And that becomes kind of a design thing. You want to be careful about the way you build those dependencies. So for one of that means by them being loosely tied together. For instance, one of the things we don't want to do ever is say new activity. So we'll never say new main activity, new food list activity. We're never going to call the constructors on any of these objects. We're going to actually let the Android operating system, in all cases, create new instances of those activities. So we just tell it, here's the activity I want, and let Android create it, because there's a bunch of things that has to go into there to get a new activity onto your screen. Typically, we call the first activity that the user sees, we call that the main activity. And if you create a new project, if you looked at any of those, you've seen that the activity that's automatically created is called main activity. So that's typically what it's called. It doesn't have to be called that. You could rename it to something else, but I would strongly request that that you stick with that name, main activity, for everything that we build. So whatever your first activity that the user sees should always be called main activity, regardless of what it does, regardless of what the application is. The first activity is always main activity. Okay?
Yep.
So activities can be arranged once or organized as you get further in it. You can arrange them in parent-child relationships, and you're going to specify that in the manifest. So if I were to, let me go in here and kind of draw an example of this out with that parent-child relationship. So if we think about maybe navigating around a store, let's say maybe you're navigating around what's the app that you can use to get groceries kind of delivered to you?
Instacart.
Instacart. That's what I'm thinking. So let's say we're building Instacart, right? So we're going to have main activity. That might be the first one that you see. And in Instacart case, what's probably going to be on that first activity? What might be the first thing that you're presented with?
Like logging in, maybe?
Probably logging in, right? So that main activity in their case, in the Instacart case, might be your login. That might normally be there. So from there, once you've logged in, what might you see next?
Home screen.
Might see your home screen. Okay. So, well, what's on your home screen?
Perhaps my address, my last order.
Okay. So you might have some information from there. That's possible. Somebody else. From the home activity, where might I then be able to go? What kind of things might I want to be able to do?
I'm assuming like starting a new order, I guess.
Okay. So you might start a new order. So what's the first thing you need to do to start a new order? Do you say new order? What's the first step there?
I don't know, like picking a store, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. So we might have a store list activity then. Right? So it's going to display a list of stores, or we might say pick store activity. Okay. So you might go to pick a store. What else? So now I've got my store picked. What might be my next thing to do?
Food selection.
Okay, so I might need to pick some food. So pick food. So let's say I've got an activity there where I can pick some food and add it to my shopping cart. What do I need to do then once I've kind of finished adding stuff to my cart and I'm ready to place the order? Well, I probably need... Huh?
You should have a shopping cart.
I probably need a shopping cart. Now, you'll notice as I'm naming these, I always end these with the name activity. So I wouldn't name an activity shopping cart, okay? Because the problem is that looks like it's the model class, okay? It looks like you're going to usually have a model class with maybe that name. So if you just say shopping cart, then I don't know if this is an activity or if it's a model class. Does that make sense?
Model class. Did we use that word before?
That would be, we haven't really. But that would, when we're talking about model classes, it's a class that represents like a database entity is the way you can think about it. So there might be a one-to-one between, like, every database table, you might have a model class for that. So I might have a shopping cart table, and therefore I would have a shopping cart object. So I would call this shopping cart activity to disambiguate what kind of thing it is.
You mean a database of different shopping carts and different statuses?
Well, no, I mean a database of all the orders and everything. So it would have, like, your products in there, it would have your foods, it would have your stores, have your shopping carts, it would have your orders, right? So once I get stuff into the shopping cart, I probably need to then actually place the order. So I might have a place order activity thereafter. Okay, so the typical kind of workflow, right, might be something like that. And then finally, we might have another screen once you place the order. Maybe you need to confirm the order or whichever. So we might have a workflow like that. Now, if I think about how I can get there, right? So let's think about, from home activity, right? Which of these screens should I be able to get to?
Yeah, you should be able to get to all of them, right? They're kind of at an even level. But they
are
wouldn't
they?
go for...
So can
Yeah.
let's say, okay, so let's think about the first one, right? So I'm from home. Can I go to pick a store?
If you want to
Definitely.
change your home store, I guess you could do that. Depends on how you want to define that functionality.
Right. At some point, I'm going to need to pick a store. That would make sense for that to be connected there. What about picking a food? Can I pick food without picking a store?
Well, assuming all the stores carry the same stuff, yeah, but I think you should pick the store because some things may not be carried or out of stock.
Okay. So one way through this might be to go through here, right? So I might go through there. But if I have a default store, maybe I've saved what my default is in the past, or my current store, then I might be able to go down here, right? So if I already have a store remembered, I might be able to go from home to pick. That would be okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's possible. If I think about the shopping cart, well, once I pick food, I would definitely expect there to be a way directly there. Also, maybe I've started an order or put stuff in my shopping cart and I left the app and came back. Then I would expect to be able to go back here if I've kind of started an order and left. And that's the other reason why you might get into pick a food, is because maybe you started an order and therefore you need to go back. And a similar kind of note, maybe I go to my shopping cart and I see, well, I needed to order onions, right? And so I don't have onions in my shopping cart. I need to go back to pick that. So I might navigate this way as well.
These entities here,
these are not entities. These are classes.
I'm sorry.
These are activities.
Yeah, these activities. They are. How do you refer to them when they're at the same level? Are they like sister activities? Is that what you call it? Or
they would be siblings. So if they're the same level, they would be siblings. And then I might go from here. I might go to place my order, right? And maybe then when I'm done with placing my order, I might finally go back to, here. But there might not be a way specifically to go from home to, say, here. Now, the question is how do I arrange these in terms of parent-child relationships? And that can be a little bit tricky because you can see there's a few different ways to navigate through the app, right? There's a few different ways to get there. So what you have to sometimes suss out is where, what really owns a particular activity. Where is the ownership hierarchy? So if we're thinking about main and login, this is definitely a case of ownership. Let me go ahead and take a copy of this and make a. Can I duplicate this slide? do I have no way of doing that? No, I don't. Well, that's great. Oh, maybe?
Is Jamp
Yep.
is Jamboard made by Google or?
Yes, it is. It is.
Oh, well, can't you just make it like select it all
No,
and then
I'm
copy?
trying. I hit control and or shift and it doesn't select it all. Anyway, so if I'm let me just use a different pen then. So pen, let me go pen color. Maybe we'll go blue. So if I'm thinking about these two, this is a clear case where that the parent activity of home is main activity, right? Because this is the only way I can get there. Everybody with me so far on that? And I would expect if I say maybe go hit the back arrow, I would go back up here. So that's a definite case where I would say, well, there's a parent-child relationship. What about between pick food and pick store, right? What is, if I'm thinking about here, what is the parent of pick store? What's the parent activity?
Home.
Home. Okay. So I can write that in here, right? So we've got the parent is up there. What about picking food? What's its parent?
Also home.
Probably also home. That would make sense for that relationship to be there. I'd also think, there's probably a button directly there from home. So I might say the relationship like this, but then I might say, well, place order, the only way I want to get there, I kind of want to treat as the parent is the shopping cart. So you might see, maybe you see a sort of hierarchy of parent-child in that sort of order. Now, that can be a little bit hard to suss out because obviously one of the rules is that a activity can only have one parent. Even though there may be a lot of ways to navigate through your application, you have to kind of figure out that parent-child hierarchy with that in mind. Okay. Does everybody follow me? So even though there's a bunch of ways maybe to navigate between picking food and shopping cart, the parent-child hierarchy really has to do, you have to kind of define one parent for everything. Okay?
So it would just be, we got 6 layers then, right? With place order activity at the very bottom, and then we
have 4.
Oh, we got 4.
So we've got layer one up here, or you might say layer 0. Here's layer 1, and then these 3 down here are layer 2, and then this would be layer 3.
Okay, I got it.
So that's how it might fall out. So that's something that you really have to think about as you're planning your application, is to plan those parent-child activities. It is a really important thing, but it's also often not necessarily an obvious thing what relationship they should have.
Why wouldn't pick store activity and pick food activity, why are those on the same level? Just because you can get to them from home activity?
That's one reason, but it's really subjective. I could have said, I could have put the relationship here, or I could have put the relationship here. Either one is possible. Okay, there isn't a single correct answer to this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay.
So the way I drew this with 4 layers, but this could easily be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers if I did the inheritance hierarchy a different way. Now, one of the reasons that I've done it that way is this kind of also flattens out that number of layers. By having it arranged this way, I have fewer layers. which has some benefits. Okay. So let's get back to the slides, and so you have kind of a idea of what that looks. And I actually should re-snip that. Delete the previous one. There. Okay. So that's kind of what we mean in terms of parent-child. And yeah, there's not always a correct answer to what parent-child relationships should be, because oftentimes there's multiple ways to get to a particular activity. So parent-child relationships, that's one thing we're going to define in the manifest, and we'll see that here in a minute with the practical example as well as the code lab. Layouts, every activity that you create is typically going to have a layout file that's associated with it. Strictly speaking, that isn't required. If you were, say, create all the UI through code, which you can do, but usually is not a great idea, then you can actually just skip the layout file and create all of the stuff in code. But I would generally recommend using the XML file instead for your layout to make it more configurable and to deal with different screen sizes and a host of other things. So usually that's defined in an XML file. The process of turning that XML file into actual controls, taking it from XML to views and view groups and all that, that is referred to as inflating or inflation. So the activity is going to inflate the layout as part of it being created, and that's going to get us to the actual UI on screen. Okay. So that inflation is what actually creates all of the views and such from the layout that we've defined.
Why inflate? I'm not getting that. Is it just that it grows to be what it needs to be, like that?
It just is the term that they use.
How would you? That's
it is the term that it does. And that's what that term means. Inflation is taking the XML layout and turning it into actual views.
Okay.
That is the definition. So let's talk about how you implement activities or add new ones. So there's 4 steps that you have to do anytime you're going to create a new activity. And all 4 of these have to happen in order for the activity to actually be shown on screen. If you miss any one of these 4 steps, your activity, your application will not work. You won't be able to actually bring that activity onto screen. So a lot of times what students miss is that they basically create the activity using the wrong pathway. There is a pathway, and we'll look at that in Android Studio, that will do all 4 of these steps for you. And it's just a single wizard. It's relatively easy. The catch is that sometimes students kind of try to say, well, let's do each of these steps one by one, and then they forget to do 1 or 2 of these steps. But it's really worth knowing them all, because at some point, I guarantee you're going to run into a problem where one of those steps didn't happen or isn't happening, and therefore your application is not working. So I would really, 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 really strongly recommend that you write these down. Find yourself a sheet of paper, find Notepad, write all of those steps down so that you have them for reference, and that way you can check. If you're getting errors and it's saying, hey, I can't show this activity, it's probably because you're missing one of those 4 things. So one of the things you have to do is obviously define an XML, a layout file for it. So for instance, in resources right now, we have activity main, right? So that's our layout file. If we have a second activity, then that might be called activity second. It might be called activity pick food, activity pick store, shopping cart, place order. So we might have, we'll probably have, 6 different layouts here for each of those activities. So you need a layout file. You also need an activity Java class that represents the backend code for it. That code needs to extend app-compat activity. The base class for app-compat activity is activity. So that does mean everything that's a subclass of app-compat activity is also an activity, which is important. That base class activity is what everything has to descend from to be an activity. The reason we use app-compat activity instead is because it provides some additional compatibility features beyond what's just basically in the activity, which is bundled with Android. So the app-compat activity comes from a support or Jetpack library that adds support basically all the way down to lower versions of Android that don't have certain things. So because of the current state of the world, it used to be that it was sometimes okay to make your activities just the subclass of activity if you didn't need to support older versions. The way the things have kind of shifted, your activity should just always be a subclass of app-compat activity and really never anything else. So that's because of a lot of different things in terms of compatibility. It needs to be that rather than just activity. Okay?
Is that with the metadata? Is that what that does?
No, it's not metadata.
All right, that's something else. I got confused with something else.
No. So when we create our activity class, we need to make sure that it extends app-compat activity. Again, if you go the right route, that happens automatically. If you say new Java class, new class, that obviously won't happen because by default your classes are subclasses of object. But if you say create a new activity, then this will actually do that step for you. The other thing you need to do is then once you've got those two pieces, you need to connect the two. So you need to connect the activity with the layout. And the way that we connect those two is inside of onCreate, we call that method setContentView. So that does the connection or the inflation of the layout into the view groups, and that's into the views and view groups, and that's what that part is. So that's the step 3 is really just one line of code typically, but we have to remember that otherwise there won't actually be anything on screen, and then Android will complain because every activity has to have something on screen. You don't have the option within activity to not have a UI. It must have a UI. So if you try to start your activity, you don't run that one line of code, it's going to crash. Next up, and last thing we have to do is declare the activity in the Android manifest. So in the manifest, it's kind of a collection and information about everything that's in your app. So the manifest has to contain a record for every activity that you have. It needs to know about every one. If you try to start an activity or use an activity that isn't in your manifest, then Android will say, well, I don't know about that activity, right? You haven't declared it. You haven't said it's in this package. So the activity won't actually start up. Your application just crashes. So typically, if any of these 4 steps are not in place, you can expect your application to crash or not compile at all. They have to be there. Those are not optional. So again, I would really strongly recommend you write down those 4 steps in your notes, because you do need to remember those. I expect there's going to be some homework questions on them. But there's also, this is kind of one of those things that a lot of students get into a problem and their application doesn't run because one of the 4 steps is missing, or you're not thinking about one of those steps. So in terms of defining the layout, Your layouts, we kind of started looking at those last week. So we typically have them in a constraint layout is our root container. Realistically, it can start with anything. If the only thing your screen has on it, it can just be a text view. Like the whole layout file can just be a text view if that's all you have there. If everything on the screen is inside of a scroll view, the root of this can be scroll view. You don't have to have, per se, a layout at the root. It can be anything. But you do want to have a layout file for that screen. Okay? Defining the activity class. Anytime you create a new activity, you're going to kind of get this skeleton. So here we've got a main activity. You can see that it extends app compatibility. That needs to be there. And you'll also notice as the template started, it already added this method on create. So that method on create gets called when the activity, when Android asks for that activity to start being created. It's the first thing that comes in here and happens. And you can kind of think of it a lot of times as your constructor. It's not the same as a constructor, but it is oftentimes very, very similar to it. So this is when effectively kind of think of that's when the activity gets created. You'll notice in here we're calling super.onCreate. Remember, super refers to the base class. So we're calling the base class's version of onCreate before we start writing our own code. That's important. Anytime you're overriding a method in Android, make sure, in Java in general, most type-safe languages, you want to make sure you call the base class before you write your own class, your own code. Okay? Sometimes you can leave this line out and you may not even notice that there are bugs. But there are some subtle bugs that happen if you don't include super.onCreate, because there is some code and there is some things that does to set things up. So make sure that is in there.
When we start a new layout, empty empty layout, it does that automatically, doesn't it?
It does, but you can remove that line. What I'm saying is, don't remove that line.
Oh, okay, all right.
Sometimes people make the mistake and they're kind of mucking around with their code and they delete a bunch of code, and in that process they delete super on create. Well, then it's later that they may or may not notice that they have some very weird bugs happening because that's not there. Okay. But yes, when you create a new activity, it automatically puts that in there. If you say create a new Java class, this doesn't happen automatically. This only happens if you create a new activity. So next up, we want to connect. We want to do step 3 of that, connect the activity and the layout, those two files that we've created. We do that with set content view. That's what actually does the inflation. And then we give it the layout resource. So you can see it starts with r.layout.activity.main. So R is a class that is generated. It's generated code. You never write that R class yourself. It's generated from the resources that you have in your res folder. So when you hit build and run or run your application, this class gets rebuilt. And sometimes you'll see errors in your code where it looks like it should be valid code, and especially if you're referring to R, whether clearly or not so clearly, it may be that red underline doesn't go away until you hit build or run your application because it hasn't rebuilt the R class. So sometimes it does a good job and rebuilds R every time there's a change. Sometimes I've seen it miss changes, and so that's where sometimes I have to run the application to get it to rebuild R. So that's sometimes what you're seeing. If you're seeing a red squiggly that's there and then goes away as soon as you run it, that's probably because R was stale. The next thing you have is layout. So this is saying kind of what kind of resource is it. So we're looking at a layout resource. And then we have the name of that XML file is activity_main. And you'll notice in here, because this has to be a variable or a property name, a field name, your activities also need to be the name of those files, the name of your resource files always needs to be a valid Java identifier. So for instance, if I have any files in my res that have spaces in there, remember spaces is not a valid Java identifier, that will break your entire application. If any one file in your res has a space in it, the entire application won't run because it's not a valid Java identifier. Does that make sense? Because all of those files need to be included in this R class. So again, make sure that everything that you put in res is a valid Java identifier. That means generally putting letters and numbers, avoiding any special characters except for, underscores okay. So we'll use underscore to separate words, but we avoid a lot of the other special characters in our file names. Most of the other ones, just that's the one we're going to use. And then finally we look at, you're going to declare it in the manifest. So the way you declare it in the manifest is it's an activity tag, and it needs to have this property Android name, and that is the name of the class. So in here you can see that the name of the main activity class is .main activity. Now that dot is short for your package name, right? So if my package name is edu.ranken.prsmith.hellotoast, well, that's effectively what's being put in here is the package name. Cool. So if your code, if you say put your activities in a different package or you start moving things around, then you may need to change that, and that will no longer just be dot if you move your packages around or you rename your packages. So as we're looking at, what's declared in the manifest, if you look at what's initially there when you create a new project, you'll notice there's some additional stuff inside of this activity tag. You can see the opening tag and the closing tag here. Inside of that, there is this intent filter. And that intent filter, basically what it does is it tells Android that this is the launcher activity. This is the main activity for my app. It doesn't know that just based on the name. It needs this stuff to know that it should show it as an icon in your list of installed apps, and B, that this is the activity that it should start when they click on said icon. Okay. So we're seeing that inside of intent filter, it says that the action needs to be main and the category needs to be launcher. We'll talk more about intents later. Just understand that this needs to be there for the main activity. And it won't be there for any other activity, just for the main activity. Okay? So you'll see that in your manifest. So let's talk about intents. So an intent is instructions or a description of an operation that you want to be performed, that you want this operating system to do. So that intent is used to request things that are basic application components. So if you remember right, the basic application components are three things. They are activities, they are services, and they are broadcast receivers. All three of those things we're going to use intents to invoke them or for them to receive data. It's both ways. We ask for them, and we pass data to them, and we receive data in them using this intent. So this intent is kind of a package to pass data around. Does that make sense? So it tells us what activity you want to start or what component do you want to start, do you want to access, as well as maybe some additional data needed to to start up that component. So that intent always goes to the Android operating system first. The Android operating system kind of figures out what to do, and then it may launch, it may come back and launch that component back in your app, or that component may launch in another app if you're, say, dealing with Facebook or the gallery or your camera. That may be another application that component launches in. So what can intent do? It can start an activity. So for instance, let's say you want to click on a button and it starts a new activity for entering some text. You might do that. Or clicking the share button opens up the app that lets you pick a photo, etc. So you might start an activity with an intent. You can also start a service. Say you want to start downloading a file in background. That might be something you would use an intent there to start up a service for downloading. Or it could be to deliver a broadcast. And that would be system information about what's happening with your device. So for instance, you might get an intent that tells you that the phone is now charging, or the phone's battery is at 70%. Both of those things would come through as a broadcast, but they're still packaged in an intent. Okay. There's two kinds of intents that we can get. We can either have explicit intents or we can have implicit intents. Now, when we use an explicit intent, those we typically use for things that are within our own application. So we might say, I want to start specifically the pick store activity, or I want to start the pick food activity, or the shopping cart activity. Those would be, I use an explicit intent, and I would say, which activity do I want to start up? Which activity do I want to open? Implicit intent would be, on the other hand, it would typically be something that's outside of our application. So we would say, here's what I want to do. Go open the appropriate activity to do that thing. So for instance, if I want to get a photo, then I might send a specific intent, an implicit intent that says, well, just give me a photo from wherever is available in the operating system that can give me photos. Or let's say I want to dial the phone number. Well, I would build up an implicit intent, give it the phone number, and it would then go open up the phone application on your device and figure out what, deal with it there. Or you say, here are some GPS coordinates for your store, right? Well, you would pass those off as an implicit intent, and Android would figure out what application can actually give you directions. Does that make sense? So an explicit intent is generally within your own application, where you're saying specifically what to load, versus an implicit intent, you're just kind of giving some general directions, and it goes off to another application.
So implicit intent probably is going to prompt the user again in most cases, maybe not all.
If they have more than one app that can do that, then it will typically ask them for which app to use. But if there's only one app to choose, then it typically would just go right into that. So a lot of people only have one camera app. So if you give them or they only have one phone app. So if you give them a phone number, or say ask for an image, ask to use the camera, you're typically going to go directly into one app without picking, if that makes sense. So implicit intents, we'll talk a little bit more in here in these slides. We'll talk more about those on Friday. That's Friday's topic is just implicit intents, and talking about some of the ways that you can use those. So today and on Wednesday, we're focusing primarily on an explicit intents, and that's what the labs will be around, is an explicit intents. So given that kind of background, let's talk about how we actually start an activity. So to start an activity, using an explicit intent, simplest possible way, we do two things. We create the intent, we send it. So to create new intent, you say, let's create a variable for it. Type intent, the name with it. You see an uppercase I indicates it's a class. Lowercase I here, it's a variable. So we have a variable named lowercase intent. Data type is intent. We're going to say new intent. The constructor for intent takes two things. The first thing is a context, which you'll remember from previous lessons that our activity is a context. So that's why I'm going to pass this. And then I need the activity that I want to start. So I would say this, and then let's say I want to pick, I want to go to the shopping cart activity. This should be shopping cart activity dot class. So that's how I create the intent to go explicitly where I want. And the part that tells you that it's explicit is that the fact that this has a class object in here as the second parameter. If you have a class there, it is a explicit intent because you're telling it what component you want to get to. And then once we build up that intent, we're going to say start activity. So we're going to call start activity, pass it the intent. That's going to start the activity. Okay, so those are your two steps that you need to do in order to start a new activity. Simple as that. If we want to say start an activity using an explicit intent, and this is where we're telling it, here's kind of what I want to do, go find the right activity that can do it. So here I create, it's kind of very similar. I create an intent, and then I call start activity with that intent. The difference here is rather than passing in this, the context and a class, I pass in a string that represents the action, and there's a bunch of constants in Android that you can use there, but you pass in a string and then you pass in what's called a URI. URI and a URL are very similar. Remember, a URI is a more general classification of things. So, for instance, a URL is typically just things that you can type into the address bar in a browser, versus a URI includes other things like telephone addresses, mail to links, and things like that are considered URIs, but not URLs. But they have a very similar structure, so it can get confusing. But that's what you need to pass, is an action and a URI. So that's the difference between explicit and implicit. It's what you pass to the constructor for the intent. Does that make sense? So
yep.
Either way, you're creating an intent and you're calling start activity with it. It's just how you construct that intent that changes. So to give some examples of some implicit intents, maybe I want to open a web page in the user's browser. I can take that URL here, which is http www.google.com. I can say, let's parse that URI, and this is a method that's built into Java. So we parse that. That gives us a URI object back. If there's anything wrong, though, with that URL, as said, this will actually throw an exception. So you also have to deal with exceptions potentially for parsing URIs. But assuming that all works, we get URI back, and then we're going to create the intent. And remember, we need to pass a string plus a URI object. So in here, we're using the constant intent.actionView. And you kind of know it's a constant because of the uppercasing of the name. Action view, you can see, is all uppercase, so it's a constant. So that's the string that represents what action we want to do. And then we pass in the URI to represent what page we want to do. So action view says, I want to open up this web page. It may also represent opening up other things that we'll talk about more later. But the simplest case is just, here's a URI for a web page, go open it up. And then you say start activity. Similarly, if we want to say dial a phone number, I could say, well, let's create a URI, but here I'm passing a tel link. You'll notice it starts with TEL : right? That's the protocol. So this case would be, this is a URI not a URL. And that's part of why there's the distinction. So whether it's a URI or whether it's a URL, it always starts with basically the protocol name, or what type of thing is it, and then colon. Every URI starts with that. But the ones that are considered URLs, only the ones that start with HTTP or HTTPS colon, those are the only ones that are considered as URLs. Okay? That's kind of the distinction. So I create this URI, and then I pass in the URI here, and I can pass in intent.actionDial. So ActionDial says, I want to take the telephone number that's here and dial it, which actually means that Android will open up your phone app, type in the number, but it won't actually hit the call button. If you want to hit the call button, then you do action call, and that will not just dial a number, but also initiate the call. So that action can change what it does with the URI. Okay? Or what kind of applications it considers. So thinking about how activities run, and to kind of give you a start and looking into some lifecycle things, all of your activity instances are managed by the Android operating system. They're always started by an intent, which is kind of this message to the Android runtime to start the application component, or in this case, the activity. So we might, for instance, maybe we start with the user boots up the device, they're on the home screen, and they click an icon on the launcher, right? So they click an icon on the launcher, that in itself generates an intent. Even though that button's kind of outside of our space, that from the home screen will actually fire an intent, and that will end up launching our activity. Okay. So intents may be fired from our code. They might be fired from the Android operating system or other applications. So that will start our main activity. Okay, so we go from the launcher to our main activity. Let's say the user clicks on shop. Maybe that sends another intent, which will then start the food list activity. So this would be like an explicit intent here as well. Okay, this first one is going to be generally an implicit intent. This would be explicit, and then this would also be explicit here. So we might say, okay, well let's pick a food, and then once we've picked the food, we'll go to the order. Let's go to the order activity, and so that'll come in here. So every time we send an intent, you can see we're starting a new activity. Everybody with me here?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
And so given that, one thing to know, when I start that new activity, the old one, the previous one here, doesn't go away. Okay, so if I go from the launcher to main activity, the launcher doesn't go away. The launcher is still running. If I go from main activity to food list activity, main activity is still running in the background. Okay, same way when we go to food list order activity. All of those three activities are now still running, but they're basically running in the background. At any given time, the user can only see typically one activity in the front, and everything else will be in the background. So you can kind of think of these kind of almost as stacked on top of each other. So the order activity is on top of the food list activity. Food list is on top of main. Main is on top of home. So you can kind of think of it as a stack. Okay. And one of the things you commonly need to do with the Android apps is be able to go back, right? You go back to a previous screen, right? Well, the way that works is it goes back through the same chain. So if I go back from order activity, it'll go back to the activity that launched it, right? So if I hit the back arrow on the phone, it'll go back here, and then finally back to the launcher. Okay? So it keeps track of that, and that's part of why it doesn't destroy that, is because you might come back to it later by pressing the back button. Okay. Any questions?
No, sir.
Okay. So let's talk about, in that process, how do I send and receive data? So in terms of, every time I start an activity, I can potentially send some additional data along with it with that intent. I can also potentially, when I close the activity out and say maybe I return, there's also ways to send data back. So I can send data forward, but I can also potentially send data back as you're traveling back through that stack. And we'll look at how to receive that data as it comes in as well. So there's two different ways that we can send data. We can either send it as data. Data in the intent is just a single URI. And that has to be represented as it's a single piece of data, but it has to be represented as a URI. So for instance, if we think about those implicit intents that we looked at previously, what were some of those URIs that I had? There were two examples. What were those two examples of URIs?
It's a telephone number and a URL.
Right. So I can pass that along. I can pass that along as a single piece of information. Technically, you can pass that URI with both explicit intents and implicit intents. You just have to add it in after the fact. But generally, you'll see a data always being passed for an implicit intent. And very rarely do we pass data for an explicit intent. For explicit intents, we usually lean on extras. Now, a lot of times that data that we need to pass can't actually be easily represented as a URI, or that restriction that you can only pass one thing is just too constraining. So a lot of time, most of our data, whether it be implicit intents or whether it be explicit, usually is passed as extras. So an extra extras are a collection of kind of key value pairs that we can pass along with the intent. So I can say, well, maybe I want to open up and look at a product. I might pass in the key is product ID and the value is 3. And that would let me see product 3. Same way if I was going to maybe edit it or if I wanted to add it to my cart, right? So the extra can represent a lot of things. It can represent maybe booleans or integers or strings. It can actually also include string lists. There is kind of a limit to what you can pass as an extra, but there's a lot of additional data. That's generally how we're going to pass our data around, is using these extras.
Is it similar to, I think it was with the JSON web tokens, where you can have data that's kind of contained in your user object, but you really want to keep that to a minimum? Is this something you want to minimize? And
yes.
Bare minimum there?
Yes, you do want to minimize how much you pass around as extras. Because one of the things to keep in mind, as I said, we're going from this activity down to here, right? Remember I said all of these activities still stay live, right? As I'm in order activity, all 3 of these activities still exist. Everybody remember that? Well, because those activities exist, the instructions to create them also have to exist. So that means the intent that we use to create order activity has to stay around. The one for food list has to stay around. The one for main activity has to stay around. So not only do we have to keep the activity still running, we have to keep all of the intents for that. So that means if you put a lot of data into the intent, right? Let's say back here at the beginning at food list, let's say I put 2 gigs into that intent. Well, now that 2 gigs is going to be around for a long time. Does that make sense? So yes, we want to minimize how much we put into those extras. That is generally a good idea. Okay?
Yep, thank you.
So the less we can put in there, usually the better. So as far as sending and receiving the data, so the first thing we do now, if we're going to pass data in the sending activity, the original activity, we're going to say first, let's create the intent object, and we can do that using either of the methods that we saw. And then we're going to put the data, the extras, into the intent, and then finally we start the activity. So the only thing that changes if we need to send data is we add additional step in there. Between creating and start activity, we add a step to add the data or the extras in. And then finally, over on the receiving activity, we want to, first of all, get the intent object that was used to start the activity, and then we can retrieve the data or the extras out of that intent object. So we put them in before we start the activity, and then we pull them out after we've started the activity. And oftentimes this involves some additional processing with that data, such as a call to the database or maybe even a call to the internet. So putting a URI in as intent data, let's say I want to do that. The method to use is intent.setData, and you can use the setData method with either explicit or implicit intents. So I can use .setData, that will then put that URI in there. If I want to say, maybe I want it to open a file, so I might say still intent.setData, but here it might be URI.fromFile instead of URI.parse, and then I give it a file object. So this would say, well, I want to open SD card sample.jpg, and so that's the URI I'm passing along. To put extras into the intent, which again is usually the thing you want to do, the method to use is put extra. Okay, put extra. So put extra takes two things. It takes the key and the value. So the first parameter is always the key, and so that will always be a string. The first parameter must always be a string. So that's the name of the parameter that we're passing through. And the second thing is the value. So in this case, we're passing the key is level and the value is 406. Okay? And put extra is actually overloaded, so it can take a wide variety of different types. So you can pass in doubles, you can pass in strings, and it will kind of determine which method to use based on the data type of the variable that you're passing in. So here we're passing an integer. We can also pass in, say, a string or a string array. Here we've got a string array, call it value. And here I say, well, let's create a new string array, call it food list. It's got rice, beans, and fruit. So I'm passing in the value is that array, rice, beans, and fruit, but the name, the key of it is food. So again, remember the first argument will always be a string, and the second argument can be, well, whatever value you want to pass through. The catch is this name, right? I've now declared this as level. I need to use that same name in both the sending activity and the receiving activity. Same way with food. I need to use food in the sending and the receiving. What's that?
What is that arrow part of the syntax, or is that just
no?
Okay.
Yeah, that's not part of the syntax. That's just part of the example. That's just part of the slides. So ignore the arrow.
Oh, all right.
It's just a bullet. So it is possible to potentially set multiple things at the same time using this bundle. Please don't do that. That is using put extras to set multiple like that. That's a much more advanced topic than is really beyond the kind of things that we'll be doing in this course. So I would ask that you always use put extra for the things that we do, not put extras.
Yeah, Mr. Smith, is there any value added to doing it this way, with the extras as opposed to just a single data object? I mean, even if you got a single thing that would work for data, why not just do it this way every single time?
Most of the time, it's safer to just assume it be an extra.
Okay.
Most of the time, I would just do it as an extra. The one case where I need to put it in as data is if I'm calling another application. Because other applications may, or things that are built into the Android operating system may require and expect it to be in as data. Does that make sense? So there may be some things that expect it to be data.
Okay.
So for instance, if I want to open up a URL in the browser, I can't put this URL in as an extra. It has to be data. Cool.
Okay.
So it depends on the thing you're passing to it, and some things will expect it as data. But if you're writing your own code, yes, it's usually if you have the option to do it as extras, then do it as extras. So let's say we want to send data to an activity, and we're going to pass along some of these extras. So up here, I've got kind of maybe at the top of the class, I've defined a constant. Here it's extra.message, extra_message_key. You can see this is public static final string, so it's a string constant. And it's public because it's available in other classes. And the reason I need to make it public is I need to actually have it available both in the sending and the receiving, because I'm going to use that string in both places. So here we've got kind of a long name, com.example.android.toActivities.extra.message. Some developers follow the convention that your extra should start with your package name, which is what they're doing here, com.example.toActivities. That's not a strict requirement. It's okay if this is just message. That's fine, and most of the time that works. So a lot of times I end up keeping my extra strings a lot shorter because there's not usually a need to have it that long. Okay. The only reason where you might do that is if you're expecting this to come from maybe another application. So that's the name of the extra we're going to pass is message. We're going to create a new intent. So this is kind of a constant. This is in these lines for now would be in response to maybe a button click. We create the new intent, pass the context, and it's going to go to second activity. The data that we're going to pass is this message, hello activity. So I'm going to pass in the message here to put extra. So I pass in the first thing as a string, which represents the key. And the second thing would be the value, which in this case is hello activity. Okay, so I create the intent, add the data, start the activity. Okay, so that's basically how you add data in there. You just put extra. As far as getting the data back out on the other side, you can call get, if you're passing it through as data, as a URI, you would say get data. So for example, I would say intent.getData, and maybe if I was passing some sort of GPS coordinates, I might pull this out as URI, location URI, because the data I'm expecting is GPS. Or if I want to pass in extras, if I'm passing extras, then I would say, well, call get int extra. Now you'll notice on the sending side, I just called put extra. It automatically decided what data type it needed to be based on the variable. When you come to the other side and you're receiving the data, notice that I actually have to put the name of the data type into the method. So if I'm passing it in as an int, then I need to call get int extra. If I'm passing it in as a string, I need to call get string extra. If I'm passing it in as a long, what method do I need to call? On the receiving side?
Get long extra?
Get long extra, right? But what method did I call to put it in? What method do I call to send that long?
It was send data. I don't have the slide up above. Put data?
Put extra, right?
Put, yeah.
So it's put extra and get int extra, right? So there's a pairing there. So the put doesn't have the data type, the get does. It's worth noting, and this usually gets people caught. It does remember the data type that it was put in there as. So if you try to pull it out as another data type, it's going to say I can't find it. So for instance, if you say put a string in here, but you call get int extra, you're going to end up saying, well, I can't. It's going to end up saying I can't find that value. So those data types do have to be paired. And even if you say like put extra, you put a long in there. If you say get int extra, it's not going to find it. vice versa. If you say put extra, put an int, and then ask for long, it's not going to convert the value. So even normal rules of converting data types between byte and short and long and doubles, those don't happen when you're putting and getting values in this bundle. Mo, did you have something to say?
No, I accidentally clicked. I was just
Okay.
my bad.
Yeah, so just be forewarned, automatic conversions don't happen. Okay.
That's not too useful there, that second one. I mean, maybe I'm missing something here. Like, you're calling it level, but you're just importing something directly as 0. What does that do?
Okay. So that second argument to the get extra is the default value. So default value, we're saying 0. So if you didn't pass an extra, right? If I didn't pass a level, then it's going to use 0 instead.
Okay, why not just go int get int extra and then set it to 0? I mean, wouldn't that be easier?
Well, the problem is, can you pass through? How do you know that there's not a value, right? Because if there's no value, I can't return null. Does that make sense? Get int extra has to return an int. It can't return null, right? And it can't return 0 as you can't just assume that 0 is the default value. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So you typically should always specify, always should specify a default value to say, here's what you want to use if the sender did not give you that value. So in the case here, we would say, well, the message, we passed the message. I might say get string extra and assume it's empty string by default. But I always want to specify a default value there. So that I know here's what it should use if there's an error there. I forget to pass a value. You can also potentially send data backwards. So we talked about just now how to send data forwards to a next activity, but sometimes when the user goes back to a previous activity, you may need to send data back. So the way that we do that involves changes to both sides. So on the sender side, we have to call it not with start activity, we have to start it with start activity for result. So start activity for result says that I'm expecting to get some data back when they're done with that other activity. Okay. So I might open another activity to say, we'll prompt them for their name, and then once they've finished entering their name, it will send that data back. Okay? So start activity for result says start the activity, but I'm expecting a result to come back. And then to get the data back to the original activity, there's a few things we have to do. So let's say you save that name. We're going to do some validation and determine that it's all good. But we need to create an intent. And then we need to say, put the data that we want to send back into that new intent. And this intent is not the same intent that we used to start the activity. It's a brand new intent. So we're going to put it extra, put the data that we need to send back. We also want to set the result code to result OK. If everything's good, they entered good data, we'll send it back. If for some reason they've decided that to cancel the operation, or they've hit the back arrow, navigated back, then we'll instead get the result as result canceled. So results canceled says that we've aborted that operation. And so we'll pass that intent then to a method called setResult, which is not shown here. And then finally, we call finish. So finish destroys the activity that you call it on. So we destroy that activity, and that will take us back to the original. Back in the original, we need to override the method on activity result, because that's where we're going to, that's where the sender is going to receive the response. Okay? So we need to start with start activity for result, go send some data back, and then finish the activity, set the result, and finish the activity, and then we'll receive it in on activity result. We'll do an actual practical with this here in a minute. So start activity result takes two parameters. It takes an intent, which is that intent that's coming back as the result. And it also includes a request code. Now that request code we actually gave it, it's an identifier that we assign when we start the activity. So when we start activity for result, we'll give that a number. So say 5 or 3 or whatnot. We'll put that code in there, and then that code will come back here as that second parameter here. So that's always an integer. So start the activity, we'll get the result. The data includes the intent includes all the extras. That's usually where the data we want. So the request code is in there, and there's also a result code that says whether it was like okay or canceled. So to look at an actual code example here, so this is on the sender side. So I've declared this variable, this request code, choose food request. In this case, it's 1. As you add more request codes, it will probably go up, and we use different ones for different requests. So we know what kind of request it's returning from. So choose food request is 1. We create new intent, just like we've done kind of previously. So this is is this an explicit intent or an implicit intent?
Explicit.
Okay, why is it an explicit intent?
Because it lists the class as the second parameter.
And the context as the first. So this is an explicit intent, and then normally we say just start activity, but here we're saying start activity for result. That takes a second parameter, so we're passing intent, and then we're passing in 1 as the request code. Okay, so the request code we'll see back later here in a minute. So that goes in, the intent and the request code. The only thing that's really different is that. When we go to the other activity, say you're ready to send it back, we'll say let's create a reply intent. This is a brand new intent. We'll put that extra in here, call it extra reply, put in the actual reply value, and that reply value we've generally pulled from the UI, maybe a text box. So we'll say, here's the extra data we want to add in, and then we'll say set result. This is kind of the magic method here. Set result, we're going to say the result code is okay, reply intent, and then finally we say finish. So finish is going to close the activity and send us back. And so the sender will get that reply intent and be able to deal with that. So then back in on activity result, this is a method we override. It's defined in the activity class. It takes 3 parameters, and I think the previous slide on there said it took 2, but that would be incorrect. So the first parameter is the request code. So remember, what was the request code in step 1?
1.
1. Okay. So I'm going to get back 1 here, and then I'm going to get a result code. That result code is going to be either result okay or result canceled. Might be something else. But what I'm looking for is that it says result okay. And then finally, it also includes the intent, that result. So I'm going to implement this method. You can see I say super.onActivityResult. So first thing I'm doing is I'm calling the parent class. So it can, if it has some things to do with that result, it can do that first. And then I want to check 2 things. So first I want to find out, is it the right result code? Because often a request code, because I may have more than 1, so I need to check, is it 1, is it 2, is it 3? And oftentimes as this grows, this first check might become a switch statement, because it's a good place for a switch statement. But I'm going to say if the request code is 1 and the result code is result okay, then okay, it's that food request that we sent, and I want to, and they said yes, this is good. They didn't cancel the operation. So once we've checked both of those things, then we can go in here and we can say, well, let's get the string extra that they added, so extra reply, and then we'll do something with that. Okay, so sending data back from an activity requires 3 steps. Okay, it requires, first of all, calling it with start activity for result. It requires then adding the result data with set result in the sender in the second activity, and then back in the first activity, it requires implementing on activity result to receive the data. Okay. So that's kind of how you can send data back and forth. We're at a point, we're almost done here. We've got one section on navigation, but it's probably a good time to take a break. So let's do that. So let's take a break until 2:30, give you a chance to stretch your legs, and then we'll kind of finish up the last few slides and get into our practical example.
You said 2:30?
Break till 2:30.
All right, cool.
Okay, welcome back. So we've got about 5 slides remaining here. So those should go pretty quick, and then we can get into the practical for today. Any questions on the material so far?
Not really.
Okay. If you haven't yet, I would strongly recommend you take notes on this material and really make yourself a cheat sheet. You can expect that everything here in lesson 2 is going to be used, especially here on 2.1 and 2.2. Everything in there is going to be used on all of the tests. So all of your hands-on tests, you'll need to refer back to this material. A lot of the lessons I know in Unit 2, unfortunately, kind of don't have 2 activities and don't use this, unfortunately. So it can be easy to forget it as we, it kind of towards the middle of class, we won't spend as much time with it. But we will come back to it, and so make sure that you have it written down somewhere where you can get back to it and refresh yourself on it quickly, because again, you can expect for the hands-on tests, all your hands-on tests, I will expect you to know how to send data between an activity and send data back. Okay,
Got it.
so take notes on those method, start activity for result, set result, finish, and on activity result, because you do want to get pretty familiar with that structure. All right. So last topic to talk about here is something called navigation, and to talk about a few of the navigation options that exist in Android. So in Android, we think about the activities, in this stack, where you kind of think about the first activity, the main activity is generally at the bottom of the stack. And then as you go to further activities, we push a new activity, we put a new activity on the stack. So every time you start a new activity, you're going to put a new activity in there. Anytime an activity ends, whether that's because you close it, your code close it, or because the user presses the back button on their device, that top activity is then popped off the stack, and then will return to the previous one below it. It's worth noting that this stack has a limited size. There's a limited amount of memory available for it. So if you keep adding things to it, eventually you're going to run out of memory, and at that point your application will crash. So you got to make sure that you pay attention to how are you adding and removing stuff in that stack, because you don't want to allow it to grow arbitrarily large. Okay? So that means anytime you go back down, you can kind of think about it. If I travel through here, I need to clean up after myself. So if I were to go from place order back to shopping cart, for instance, I need to clean up that part of the stack. I need to take the shopping cart off there. I need to go, if I go back to all the way to home activity, I need to make sure that all of that stuff gets cleaned up. Okay, so we'll talk more about that in future lessons about how to deal with the backstack, but recognize that that is there, and it's important to make your back button work, to pay attention to that. Okay, a lot of bugs in Android come to not paying very good attention to your activity stack. So let's look at an example. So in here, let's say in this application, we're going to start at main activity. That's the launcher that we start with. And then we say, okay, well, I want to go to pick a food. So I'm going to go to the food list activity. And so that's going to come onto the stack. And then I'm going to go to the cart activity, and that's going to come on the stack. So I've gone from here to here to here. And so this currently is what the stack looks like. And then if I say the user decides to go back, they hit the back arrow on their device, what's going to happen is we pop off that top activity and destroy it. So we destroy the shopping cart. If they say go back, we're going to destroy that and go back to food list. If they were to go back from here again, where would they go? If they're going to go back from food list.
Main.
Back to main, right? What would happen with food list activity?
It get destroyed.
Would be destroyed, right? Okay. So as we're kind of going down the chain, these activities are being created, but as we go back, they get destroyed. So they might go in here, they might go back to food list activity, pick another food, and then go again to the shopping cart, and then again, and then they might go further on to the order. Okay, so they go cart, activity, order, and then we're kind of all here. Now, if I want to finish placing that order and I want to go back to main activity, I need to actually go through and I need to have all of those activities be destroyed, right? So I need to make sure that if I go back to main activity, I want to destroy order activity, cart activity, food list activity, get all the way back to main. So what does that mean? That means all of these need to be finished, right? Finish destroys the activity. If I say start activity given an intent, what does that do? It always creates a new activity, okay? So if I'm here in order activity and I say, let's start activity, and I give it an intent for main activity, what would the stack look like? If I give it an intent to start main activity. Well, there would be another main activity up here.
Just in there, right? Just the main activity.
There would be another main activity here, right? If I say start main activity, I'd have main activity here and main activity on there. And then that stack can continue, right? So when I go back to main activity, I have to be very careful about how I do that. Is that okay?
Yep.
Things do not clean up for you automatically. They don't. So you have to kind of finagle the knobs to get it to get the cleanup to happen. So there's two forms of kind of quote unquote back navigation, and these work slightly different. So one thing you can do is you can press the devices, what we call the temporal or back navigation. That's the little arrow that's on your device. So if you look at your physical device, you should see at the bottom of it, like you've got an arrow, a circle, and a square, right? So that arrow, that left little triangle, is going to be back. Does everybody remember what the square does? What does the square do?
It's home, isn't it?
Close. I actually pull up my emulator here. So you've got the square, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's to show the list of running apps, basically. And the circle is home.
Yeah.
Circle is home. Okay. So that back, that's the back button that takes you back. That always, by default, will take you back through that system's backstack, which is what we're looking at here. This, on the other hand, the ancestral or up navigation, relies on the parent and child relationships that you've defined in your manifest, which we kind of talked about a few minutes ago, earlier on an earlier slide. That, as it turns out, does not do the same thing as the up navigation. So the up navigation and the back navigation are not the same.
That's the one that's typically in the top left of the screen.
Yeah, so that will be next to the title of the app. So it would be up here, right? So up here you might see this little arrow, and we'll see that in the app that we built. That's what's referred to as the up navigation. Okay.
And they might do the same things in some cases.
You can make them do the same thing, but out of the box they do not. Out of the box, those two, the back button and the up navigation, do not do the same thing. Now, I will show you a workaround to get them to do the same thing, because my experience has been that it's usually a much better UI experience for your users and as a developer to have those be the same. But out of the box, they are not the same. Okay. So the up navigation is controlled by your manifest. If you just define a parent activity, then the up button will appear. If you don't define a parent activity, then that up button won't appear, which is what you're seeing here. So if we're thinking about the up navigation uses those blue arrows, right? So let's say, and this is kind of where things get weird. So let's say I've gone through here and we've defined it this way. And I started with main. I went down to home. Everybody with me? So main, home, pick a store, pick food, shopping cart. So I've got these 5 on my stack. Cool? So if I press back from here, where will it take me? Where will the back navigation take me?
Would it take you to pick food activity?
Yep, take me to pick food activity. Okay, so back would take me here. But where would my up navigation take me? Where's the parent?
Home activity.
Home activity, right? So back would take me here, parent, but up would take me here. Do you see that? So that's one of the things that's different. In reality, even going down to pick store activity, these two, right? Let's say I go down here, right? So I've got these 3 on here. And so if I'm on this screen, where does back take me?
Home.
Back takes me home. Where does up take me?
Also home.
Also home. They still don't do the same thing. They both take me home, but they don't do it the same way. So here's the thing. So if I go back, right, well, what happens? We just remove this current activity. We remove pick store activity from the stack. Does that make sense? We remove it from the back stack. We destroy this activity, and then we're going to go resume the home activity that was previously running. Okay? Everybody with me there?
Yeah.
That's what normally happens. Up navigation, regardless of whether or not you're going this route from shopping cart to home activity, pick store to home activity, what it does, it does actually always recreates the activity that you're going to. So it doesn't go to home activity and just pick up where you left off. It will restart it, recreate it. This activity will be destroyed and recreated. So one of the things that means is if I have any state data up here, I'm going to lose that state data if I do up navigation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, you remember the count when we turned it sideways? We lost the count.
Yeah.
So if you do up navigation, the state here is lost. But if you do back navigation, the state is not lost.
So triangle good, arrow bad.
Yeah. No. Arrow good, triangle bad.
Oh, okay. I got it backwards.
Or
Okay.
sorry. I was thinking about this. My arrows and my triangles here are backwards. No, you're right. What you said is right. This triangle's good. This up arrow is bad, generally speaking.
So you just want to make those the same.
Yeah.
In almost 100% of the cases.
That's been my experience, is that this behavior is almost never desirable. The behavior that the up navigation gives you is almost never desirable. I've never seen a user that expected it to work that way. So what I do instead is I'll change that button to behave like the back button. Okay? It's actually pretty easy. It's a pretty easy change. There's just some code. I'll show you how to write it, and you just copy paste that into any activity, and it fixes the problem. So there's a very easy fix for that. It does rely on a little thing that we haven't gone to yet. We'll talk about later, because it relies on the way that you kind of hijack it has to do with menus, which we haven't talked about menus, but I think you'll be able to understand how that works right now without fully understanding menus. So the back navigation is generally goes through the back stack, as I kind of talked about. History of recently viewed screens, and it contains all of the instances for the current task. Okay, so in Android, there's a few terms that you want to write, that you want to know. One of them is activity. The other one is the back stack. Another one is the current task, or task. So an activity, remember, is a screen, right? An activity is a screen. Everybody remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. So every activity exists within a task. Okay. So this stack here, you see this stack of 4 activities? That is the task. Okay. A task is a running, basically a running instance of your application. Okay. A task you can think of as a running instance of your application. So for instance, if you have 2 copies of your application running, those would be running in 2 separate tasks, and they would have their own unique backstack because every task has its own thing. So for instance, if I'm looking at the device, I hit the square. So this program running here, that is a task. This program running here is also a task. Does that make sense? So each of those have a separate backstack. Okay?
Yep.
So that's what you're seeing there. So if you're switching between tasks, then you change which backstack you're working with.
Yeah, it's so the way it works out in this case is if you do hit the square button to change your what you're going to each instance. You know, as you scroll through what you have there, where you just have 2, those are tasks.
Yep, each of those.
They're always congruent, right?
Yep, tasks are kind of run in parallel. So what that means is I can go back to another app and I can hit back, and it will still remember how I got there. I can still hit the back arrow and it remember how I traveled through that application. So to define and get that arrow to show up for the up navigation, the way that we do that is we go into the manifest, and remember we defined an activity tag for every activity. So we'd have one for main activity, we'd have one for second activity, etc. So in the activity tag, we talked about the name. There's another attribute that you can set, which is parent activity name. So here we're saying show dinner activity. Its parent is main activity. Does that make sense? So we're setting this on the child to tell it what parent it is. So this, just putting that into the manifest, will make A, the button appear, and B, make the button go to main activity. Okay. For backwards compatibility reasons, and we'll see this when we get in, kind of look at the example in the code labs, there's another, you mentioned meta, there's a meta thing. There's a meta tag that you have to specify the parent. That's due to compatibility things that unfortunately you end up usually having to specify the parent twice. So you're going to specify it here in parent activity name, but you also end up having to specify in a meta tag that is inside of the activity.
It said in the code lab that it's for 16 and lower, but we're doing 21 through 29, right? So do we really need to?
It says that. My experience has been that that's not actually the case. The documentation says that you shouldn't need it at after 16, that it shouldn't be necessary. But unfortunately, there is a case where you still have to set it in, even in, say, API 20, API 30. You still have to set that meta because unfortunately it's actually still used. So unfortunately that's not been phased out because of the way the support libraries work. Okay?
Yep.
Yeah. I've tried to remove it and then I ran into bugs, not including both. So yep, so there's some more links to learn more on that, and so that's kind of the gist of that there. I thought, no, it doesn't mention it here. I think in the reading material, I believe for this chapter, it does mention a little bit about the square and the home button. I think both of those are listed somewhere in here. Would be towards the end. Oh, yeah. So you'll see if you go do the reading material, there'll be a little mention about the square button that shows you the tasks, as well as the circle that takes you back to the home screen. So, okay. So we want to jump into a practical example of this. And as I kind of mentioned towards the beginning of this, I'm going to actually release you this time. I'm going to have you go walk through the code lab yourself from here on out. So I'll have you do the 2.1 on your own. But before we jump into that, I want to do just a practical example of actually applying this stuff in Android Studio. Okay? So I'm going to open up Android Studio, and I'm going to kind of make an example application here. Now, I know in previous, last week we had everybody kind of coding along. I ask that you don't code along with this today, because I want to kind of move. I need to move through this pretty quick, and I don't really necessarily have time to troubleshoot issues today. So I'd ask that you just take notes as we go through this. I'll give you all the completed code once we finish it, so don't worry about that. I'll give you the finished project when we're done, so you can download that and kind of look at it. Any questions there before we get going?
Yeah, Mr. Smith, I have a question, and I think it's a pretty dumb one because I already started this last night.
Uh-huh.
But I got stuck on one of the instructions. It was like find a certain XML file, and I couldn't find it.
Okay, we can troubleshoot that later. Let's troubleshoot that after lecture. So the thing I'd ask you to do is either pull out a sheet of paper or pull out Notepad++ and take notes on what we do, so you kind of understand the process rather than trying to code along. Okay? Everybody got their note sheet ready?
I'm ready.
Zach, your light blinked, but I didn't hear anything.
Yep, right here.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to say empty activity. I'm going to call this lecture example. I'm going to put this in folder 2.1. So this is lecture example. Whoop. And I erased it. Lecture example with the space. I'm going to put 2.1 there. So it's going to go under there. Okay, all good. Hit finish. Give it a few minutes to start that project as it crunches away. Okay, so I'm going to clean this up a little bit by just deleting the hello world. Oh, that deleted the constraint. I want to delete the whole thing. So I'm going to delete hello world in there first. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up a very simple activity here with a text box and text view and a button. Okay, so what I'm going to put in here is a counter. And so I'm going to put those in. I'm going to set the margins, maybe 32, 32. Well, no. Yeah. 32, 32, 32, because I want to kind of push it down. I'm going to put the button in here. I'm going to kind of anchor it down there and to the left and right sides. And similarly kind of give it some margin away from the other two. Label. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this text view contain a counter, and we're going to say have a button here. And so every time I click the button, it's going to create a new copy of this activity. So we'll kind of see it, basically coming back to itself. But every time we start a new activity, the counter will go up. So you'll see the counter go up as we click the button, basically. And as if I hit the back arrow on the device, then it will go down. The counter will go down. So we'll kind of see what it means to send and receive some data with this, even just this one activity. All right. So I'm going to call this button. Let's say the text on this button is maybe count, right? So count is the button. Maybe we start the counter at 0. And I probably need to make that text size a little bit bigger so we can see it. So maybe I'll go up to 30 SP. And maybe I'll go to 24 SP with this one. So text size 24. So 24, 30, I can probably be 36. Okay. And maybe make that bold. All right, so I've got a counter. I've got a place to increment that count. And that's all I'm going to start with for my UI. I do want to go and extract those strings. As you can kind of see here, the yellow exclamation mark, it says that I have a hard-coded string. So you remember from last week, you want to go over to the code view, either code or split. And I'm going to select that text. I'm going to hit Alt-Enter. We're going to extract that as a string resource. And so because this is my button. Oh, before I extract resource, well, yeah, I need to rename the button. I'll do that in a minute. So Alt-Enter, extract resource, and this is going to be the count button text. Okay, so I'm going to extract that as count button text, and I need to rename both of these to give them better names. So this is the ID. I'm going to give that one is count button. And yep, refactor. And I want to change the ID of this one to count text. So we've got count button and count text. Any questions on what I did there so far? Okay. So now let's start implementing the code. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the count button. We're going to do just like we did last week. I'm going to implement that on-click property. So in here, I'm going to say Android on-click, and I want to say, well, let's say count or increment count. Okay. And then again, Alt-Enter here to get that suggestion. We're going to say create increment count in main activity. And remember that needs to stay with that signature. This view will be the thing that triggered the event. So this will be the button that they clicked on. But that whether or not I use that has to stay there. That has to be there for the signature purposes. If I remove this text here, then when I click the button, the application will actually crash because it won't be able to find increment count anymore. Okay, so inside of here, remember I'm going to create an activity and start that new activity. So let's say I want to do that here. We're going to say intent equals new intent. So we're going to construct an intent object. New intent. Remember the first argument to an explicit intent is always a context. So I'm going to pass in the context as this, which is the current activity. And then I want to say, let's go to main activity, right? So that's the activity I'm going to. I'm actually kind of going to myself. Okay. And then in that data, I want to add, what is the current count, right? So in here, I want to say intent dot put extra, and I want to put in the count, but what do I want to use for the value of that count? Well, one of the problems I have to solve is I don't currently have that count tracked anyway, right? So you remember from last week, where did I end up having to store that count for the Hello Toast example? Where did I store that data?
You put it up on the top, yeah?
I put it up on the top.
Right there, line 11.
Okay, so somebody else tell me what I wrote there. What would I write there? Sheridan. What do I need to write here? Okay, moving on. Troy?
You lost me, Chief. I don't really know what's happening.
Okay. So I need to declare what we call a member variable or a field. So how do I need to declare that field to store the count? What word do I need to put here first?
Public?
Okay. If I make it public, what does that mean?
means that we can access it from other classes.
From any class, right? Typically, your state, your fields, you want to keep those private wherever possible. So I can keep that private. Okay. If it's a count, what data type is it? Probably.
Int.
Probably an int. So private int and count would be the name of it, right? So I've got my access modifier, I've got my data type, and I've got the name of the variable. Okay. So I'm going to have a count I'm going to have up here. Maybe I want to have that count start at 0. So I might say count 0. And then when I call the next activity, it's going to get count plus 1. Okay? So when I create the new activity, I'm going to pass it in as an extra is the count. Oh, okay. Yeah, so then you may just have to push the push to talk button. All right. So
Sorry.
That's fine. So I'm going to create my intent, right? So my intent is going to main activity. I'm adding some extra information to pass into it. And then what was the last step you remember what the last step I needed to do with that intent? What do I need to do to send that intent?
You need to start the activity.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to say start activity. And so we're going to pass that intent. So start activity intent. Okay. So I create the intent, add some data to it, and then I send it. Okay. So if I try this application right now in its current state, you'll know there's not too much here yet. But if I try it in its current state, we'll see what happens so far. Okay, so it's running. If I hit count, you kind of see that something pops up, right? So it's actually starting a new activity every time I hit the button. But you notice the counter isn't going up. It's always actually blank. So, one of the things I haven't done yet is I haven't actually loaded the value from the intent, right? I'm just sending it, but I haven't actually loaded the value that's there. So I need to actually fill that in. Now, before I do that, I need to refer to the text view that's there, my label. So I'm going to make another field for that. So private text view, and this would be maybe count text. And so when we go in here, every time we create a new activity, I'm going to say, well, let's get count text, and we'll get it from find view by ID. Find view by ID, r.id, and then count text was what I called it in the XML. So we're going to get the count text field that way. Okay. Now I also want to populate that with the current count. So I might say count text dot set text. And remember, I need to take the count and turn it into a string. So I might say integer.toString and pass in the count. So that will let me take it and turn it into a string. So we see, at least initially, it starts at 0, but I still need to pull in the count that we received. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that, I need to get that intent. So the intent that we received is going to be intent equals get intent. So on the receiving side, we say get intent to receive that intent. And then I'm going to say, well, we need the count out of there. So count is equal to intent dot get int extra. So remember, the name of that extra was 0. And I'm going to say, well, if we don't have that extra, let's default the count as 0. which, as it turns out, because we've defaulted it to 0, that's going to take care of that initial state, because when we launch it from the launcher, it needs to start at 0, and it won't initially have that extra. Okay, so we start at 0, I hit count, and you can see now, every time I hit the button, that the count increments by 1. Cool? So effectively, we can kind of think of this count as being the number of activities that I have on my backstack. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if I hit back, right, I should see, if I hit the little triangle, I go back, I can see that it destroys an activity, it kind of goes away, and the count goes down.
So this is just horrible for the memory.
Oh, this is bad for the memory. I would never want to do that.
Okay.
Right, I would never want to do that. But I wanted to give you it for demonstration purposes, so you can kind of see what's happening there. Right? Yes, if I go up to 10 here, I now have 10 activities on my stack. In reality, I'm off by 1 because I'm not counting the first one. The first one's that's actually 11 because the first one's 0.
Is that why every time you hit count, it made like the screen?
Yep, flicker. There's a little transition there because it's creating a whole new screen.
Okay, I was like, am I seeing things?
Yeah, no, it's flickering. And I could probably make that more pronounced if I wanted to. So like if I could probably have the background color change. So if I say, let's go to values, colors, and maybe I define 2 color constants. So maybe we say color name is even. So we'll have 1 color for when the count is even, and I'll have another color when the count is odd. So I might say, well, let's come up with a color here. And so let's see. Now, one thing you'll notice here, this has 8 digits, not 6. Does everybody see that? Those hex values? They've got 8 digits, not 6. The reason is because these front 2 bits are alpha or transparency. So if I'm going to use this as a background color, I want to make sure that starts with FF so that it's not transparent. So here I might say, let's do maybe I don't know. Let's start with a white, and maybe I can change that a little bit. So I need 1 more F. Okay, so start with white, and then I'm going to kind of change this. So what color do we want it to be for even numbers? Somebody give me a color.
Blue.
Blue. Okay. So we'll make it kind of a light blue here for even numbers. And then what color do we want it to be for odd numbers?
Red.
Okay. So it'll switch back and forth between red and blue.
Mr. Smith, it looks like it deleted the FF on the even. Is that normal?
That's okay. That's okay. It's 6 digits, so it went down to 6 digits. If it's 8 digits, the first 2 are transparency. If you represent it as just 6 digits, then it assumes that the first 2 are FF.
Okay.
So it's fine. If I were to go in here and kind of switch the slider, there's an alpha slider here. You can either type in the % or kind of shift it here. You can see now it's added those digits back in. So it says 83 at the beginning. So it's only, they're optional if it's fully opaque.
That's just intensity, right?
No, that's transparency.
Saturation.
Transparency. Those first 2 bits are transparency. Okay, so we got red and blue, and I'm going to go back to main activity now. And so as we kind of shift that, I'm going to want to change the color. So I need to go into activity main and kind of think about where do we want to put that color. Maybe I'd like to do that maybe as the background of the whole screen. And I forget, I think to change the background here, I actually have to get into the window. So get window dot set background background drawable resource. I think that's the one I want. So, and here I'm going to say if the count, maybe I'm going to save that to a variable first. So let's say int color ID is equal to if the count is even. So mod 2, if that is 0, then it's even. So then I want to do r.color.even. And otherwise, if it's odd, we'll do r.color.odd. Okay. And so that gives me the resource. Now you'll notice that it's an integer because all of these are kind of IDs for the resource. That number is actually not the number I typed here. So the integer that I'm having is not there. It's the resource ID for the even color. Okay. So that's ID of the resource, and I'm going to put that in here. And let's see if that works. There we go. So now you can see it changes, and that maybe makes it a little bit more clear. Does that make it a little bit more clear as to what's going on there? That it's actually a new screen? Cool.
Sounds cool.
Okay. So now that I've got that kind of in place, what I'd like to do is add another button, which will then let me go to another screen. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my layout, and I'm going to add in another button using the using that. So I'm going to go in here, and maybe I want to bump up the font size on that as well. So maybe text size 24, just like the other one. And maybe what is your name? I'm going to have take it to another screen where we can adjust screen. And now 24 is probably too big. So let me go back to 14. So I'm going to give that constraints. And let's make those 32 on the side, 32 here, 32. Now, just checking that this still works on the Nexus S. I'm going to go down to generic and pick 4-inch there. Okay, so it still works on the Nexus S. So I'm going to have a button there. It's going to say, well, what is your name? And so clicking on that button will take you to another screen where you'll be able to enter your name. I also want to have a text field in there to when you enter your name and come back, I want to be able to show it here. So I'm going to add another text view underneath. And so that text view will be maybe I'll initially say look like that in the designer, as far as designer is concerned, John Doe, and maybe I'll bump up the font size on that a little bit to 24. Okay, so my goal is I'm going to click on this button. It's going to take me to another screen where I'll enter my name and it'll come back here. So that way we can kind of see data being passed back and forth, not just from the same screen, but to, you know, another screen. So in here, I need to go back to the code view. And so from the code view, first of all, I want to extract that string resource. So extract string resource, this is going to be name button text. And I need to now add the on click in here. So on click. And we're going to say prompt name. It's the name of my function. Alt enter. Create the main activity. Okay, so back in here, I'm going to now, this is where I'm going to start that other activity. Now, I have a bit of a problem because the first line of code that I need to write relies on the activity class, right? So I can't really write much here until I've actually created the other class, okay? Now, when you want to create the new activity, there's a few options that are available to you. So you remember we kind of talked about how to create additional layout variants and such yesterday. So for instance, or last week. So if you wanted to say create a new layout, you can right click on the layout here and say, well, new layout resource file. So this would give me a new layout, right? But the problem is remember going back to the steps of creating a new activity, right? How many steps do I need to do? How many different things do I need to create? Do I need to just create a new layout?
You got to do the Java class and connect it with on create.
Connect the
and
two.
And then the manifest, yeah. It's a lot of steps.
And then the manifest. So if I go this route, I'm going to have to do all 4 of those steps myself. Okay. And that's kind of you can do that. It's more work than you need to do. Same kind of thing if I go up here to the classes and I say new Java class, I could say, well, let's create second activity. And you'll notice it's created a new class file, right? But it's got none of the other trappings with it. And it doesn't even extend app-compat activity. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So the thing you don't want to do when you're adding a new activity, don't do add new class, don't do add new layout. What you want to do is add new activity. So I'm going to delete this. So instead of doing either of those routes, I'm going to go all the way up to the top, say new, and then down here you can see there's a menu for activity. And you can actually pick any of those templates. So I'm going to add a new empty activity. Does everybody see that? So it's not the top thing on the list. That's what a lot of people think. It's like, oh, we'll get it's at the top list. It's actually pretty close to the bottom of the list. So new activity, empty activity. And so this is going to be the activity where you enter your name, right? So what should I call that? What should I call that activity? What would be a good name for it?
Enter name.
Enter name? That sounds pretty good, right? So that's pretty descriptive. Now, what happens if I just say enter name? Remember I said that it should always end in what word?
Activity.
End in activity, right? And that's keeping track that it's actually an activity class. So I want to make sure I call it enter name activity, not just enter name. Okay. And if you submit your code, by the way, as say enter name, you leave off the activity, or second and leave off the activity, I am going to ask you to change it. I am going to ask you to add in that word activity if you forget it. So please, please, please include it. So enter name activity, and then the rest I'm going to leave as is. It's already generated, figured out the name for the layout, which is good. And I don't want to check the launcher activity because I already have a launcher. So we're going to go ahead and say finish. Okay, it's going to ask me, do I want to add this? Because it's just created the new Java class and the layout. So that's cool. So this is now here, and you'll notice that there's already some code in my Java class, just like we saw previously. So you see we created a Java class, extends app compat activity. You can see that onCrate method is implemented. You can see that it's calling the parent class, and you can see that there it's connecting. You see set content view. It's connecting the layout with the activity. And what word did I use to refer? What did I say is happening here?
Sorry, what was it again?
What did I say is happening here? So set content view. I take the layout and I
declare activity and manifest. Yeah.
Inflate.
Right. So this line 12 is what does the inflation. Okay. This inflates the layout XML here, activity enter name. It inflates that XML file and turns it into controls. Okay, so that's what's happening here on line 12. So I've got step 1, I've got step 3, I've got my XML file over here, and if I look in the manifest file, if you look really close, you should see that there are 2 activity tags. Does everybody see that? Which line is the new activity on?
That's line 12, isn't it?
Line 12, right? So it added in this line 12 for me, right? And that all happened because I said add new activity, right? As you kind of saw, if I say add new class or I add new layout, not all of that happens, right? So make sure that when you're adding a new activity, go ahead and do it as add new activity. And then obviously if you want to get rid of an activity, now I have to clean up all of those places, right? I have to not just delete the XML and delete the Java. I'm going to have to remember to remove this tag from there. So we can see enter name activity is in there. We can see this is here. So that's good. So in enter name activity, the XML, let's go to that layout. So the layout's here. I want to now kind of give a space to A, enter your name, and then B, to kind of save it. So also in here, I kind of want to show what's happening. So I'm also going to put in a place to store the count because I'm going to pass the count to it. And then there. Actually, this needs to be a text view. So you'll notice in the common controls, there is not edit text. Okay. So if I want to actually put in a text field, I actually have to go down and leave common. I have to go down to text. See the text category on the left here under palette. So that's how you get there. And then there's a bunch of different kinds here. So you'll notice that all of these that are kind of AB with this underline, those are actually all text inputs, just with default settings. They're different. So I'm going to go here to the one that says plain text and drop that in. Okay. These plain text, password, email, all of these actually create an edit text. They're just with different starting defaults. Okay. So up here, I might give this a name. So I might say, maybe I would say count text. Yep. And so if I try to name it count text, you see what it says. Problems are found. Count text already exists. Well, why is it giving me that complaint? Why is it telling me that count text already exists?
There's one of those in the other activity.
Right. There's a control with the same ID. Now, by convention, you usually don't want to use the same ID across multiple activities. So I actually need to give that a different name, even though it's kind of the same thing, right? But I need to give it a different name because I don't want to duplicate that. So any ideas as to what I could name this instead? What could I do to solve that problem so that they're not both the same name?
Count text 2.
Okay, so I could call it count text 2. I would avoid doing that because that's fraught with problems. Don't just add a number. Yes, that would work, but please don't do that because that's not great for then anybody that comes by and tries to figure out what's going on. What might be a better thing to do? Well, the better thing to do is put the name of the activity in there. Does that make sense? So what is the name of the activity?
Enter name.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, enter name count text. Yes, it's long. Yes, it's long. Sometimes your IDs will get very long. But does that make sense why I needed to name that as long as it is?
It won't work, or it's just good practice?
It's good practice. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes you can get away with calling it the same name. You will sometimes also run into issues with that, so I'm going to leave that as that. So enter, this might be, move that down in here. So the edit text, I might say enter name edit and refactor and enter name button. Okay, so those have some unique names. And I want to now go here. Let's say I'm going to go to 32 because that's what I did on the other one. 32, 32, 32, anchor, 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 and boop, boop, boop. And that did not give me any margin on the sides, but that's okay. Did it do the same thing back here? So design, oh, it did give me, well, I probably don't need, those can probably be 0 on both the left and the right on all of these, and that's probably okay because it's not going all the way there. Okay, so set those back to 0 on the left and the right so we're consistent. So this one would be, maybe I put 0 here. And on this one, I don't want to have any text there because the text is kind of pre-filled, pre-typed in there. So rather than putting text, I want to put a hint. So I might say enter your name as the hint and not as the text. So that, because the text is the value that's in there versus a hint is kind of a little placeholder there. Okay, so, and this button, and so the button probably wants to say save. Now, one thing I might mention here, if you've looked into the default, in the default kind of settings, the common attributes, you might notice that there's a section here that says icon. So that you can actually add an icon to your button. Say you wanted a little save icon, we can do that as well. We'll talk about icons later, but it's worth noting that they have that functionality where you can go ahead and add an icon to the button. All right, so this also wants to, I need to change the text sizes here. So up on the top, let's see, I want text size 24, text size 24, text size, I think I'm going to set all of these to 24. There we go. Make it nice and big. Okay. So we've got a place for the count. We've got a place for entering your name, and we've got a button to save all that. Okay, so now that I've got that in place, I can go back to my Java code and maybe start implementing a few things. Although actually before I do that, I need to extract these string resources and hit the on-click listener. So, extract string resource. Enter your name. Enter name. Edit hint. And this one I might say enter name button text. Okay. So those are extracted. And on the button, I can add an on click. So when you click the button, we want to say save name. Okay. And I'll extract that. So here we go. Okay. So that's kind of my skeleton. Okay. So when we save the name, it'll call this method, and I can go back to my main activity and start to implement that. So in main activity, I want to say, well, let's create an intent. And that's going to be the intent that's going to create the other activity. So new intent this, and rather going to main activity, I want to go to enter name activity dot class. And here I might want to put maybe an extra intent dot put extra, and maybe I put in the count, but here I don't need to add one. I'm just going to pass in the count as is. And then finally, let's say start activity. And so that start activity is going to be with intent. Okay. So now when I click, what is your name, it'll take me to that other screen. Cool. And I can click back to go to the previous screen. Everything good so far? Everybody following along? Okay. So what I want to do, so I've kind of started this side. I want to go to the other side and actually fill in fill in some of that logic. So for instance, if I go over here, I notice that count's not being populated. So I need to fix that. So I might say, well, private text view. This would be the count text. And I want the edit text as well. So private edit text. And this would be the name edit. So that's where I'm going to type in my name. And I think that's all I need. It's just those two fields. Okay. So when we get in here, when it starts, I need to get both of those two controls. So we're going to say count text is equal to find view by ID r.id dot edit name count text. Now, why did it not find that? Oh, okay. Enter name count text. Huh. Okay. Enter name count text. Yep, that's the one I want. And the name edit is equal to find view by ID r.id dot enter name edit. Okay, and then I want to get what was in the intent. So intent is equal to intent equals get intent. So we're going to get the intent, save it to a variable, and then I want to change the count to be what was in there. So int count is equal to intent dot get int extra. So I want to get count. We're going to default it to 0 in case it's not there. And then finally, I want to set the text that appears. So count text dot set text, and then that would be the integer dot toString and pass in the count. So we can see if I say go up to 3 and then say what is your name, you can see the count appears over there. And if I go back, you can see it takes me back to that screen. Cool? Everybody cool so far? So there and back. Other thing I might want to put in there, you'll notice in here I don't have the up arrow. Everybody see that? I don't have the up arrow on my second activity. And also, you also might notice that the app bar here, right, it says lecture example. Everybody see that? So it says lecture example on both of those activities. Now, that's an issue because I can't easily tell which activity I'm on, right? So I'd rather like it to say what the name of the activity is there. So what I need to do there is go to the manifest, and I'm going to change a few properties. So first of all, on the activity itself, I want to set the title. So Android title, I believe it is. Oh, no, it's not title, it's label. Label. And that's the text that's going to appear here. So I might say, well, let's change the label to enter name. So that's what will appear in the header. And then I also want to point it to the parent. So Android parent activity name, and that is the parent is main activity. Now inside of here, I do need to add something special, and let me just copy it from here and update it. Oh, I can't copy it from there, or can I? So it's metadata is the one I want specifically from there. Stick that side by side. So inside of this activity, I need to put meta data, and the name is that long string there, android.support.parent activity. Push that down, and then the value of that is main activity. Now there's a quirk here, so this is used for kind of backwards compatibility. It's also needed for the app bar that we'll look at later in Unit 2. But in this value, I can't actually put it as .main activity, unlike I can put it up in parent activity name. So actually in the value here, you do have to actually specify the fully qualified name. So up here, parent activity is main activity, but down here, it's the fully qualified name. Everybody following with me there? This is kind of a cumbersome thing. this was originally meant as backward compatibility. Unfortunately, we still have to put it in, even though we're at API 21 or above. Okay?
Mr. Smith, if you said for us not to like code along with you, how are we gonna get our attendance today?
The Code Labs.
Okay.
Code Labs. So that's how I'm going to specify that it is a child activity. So those two things. So let me run it now, and it should say enter name with the little arrow. So let me count up. Let's count to 2. What is your name? The count's there, and you can see it goes back. Now notice when I hit the up arrow, what did the count go to? The count didn't go back to 2. Do you see that?
Yeah.
The count did not go back to 2. Because as I kind of mentioned previously, the up arrow doesn't do the same thing. And in fact, if I hit back now, that's kind of weird because it went from 0 to 1 to 0. Right? So the way it works, the up navigation is honestly kind of weird to work with. So I'd like to fix that, right? I'd like it to be when I go to the count, right? When I go back here, I would like it to still say 2. Okay. You'll notice it says enter name there. Remember a general. So I need to fix that. The other thing I want to do here is in general, if I'm going to put in a string, remember I always want to avoid hard coding it, right? So you see this enter name. Is that hard coded?
Yeah.
That's not warning me, but it is hard coded. So I need to actually extract that. So I'm going to do Alt Enter, extract string resource. And so I might say this is activity, enter name label. So that's also in the strings XML now.
Can you explain again?
Yep.
I understand to do it, but I'm not getting why that. What does that do? Why is that better?
So here's the catch.
The language stuff.
Yeah, it's all about language. It's all about translations. So what I can do with all of these strings here is I can provide. Remember how last week we had a few different variants of the layout file? I can provide a variant of the strings.xml file in another language. So let's say I want to take this entire application and I want to make it work in Spanish, right? The only file I have to change is strings.xml. Everybody with me there? The only file I have to change is strings.xml.
Okay, I get it. You would have to change your overall language to Spanish, and it'll just pick from a different set.
Right. So I would add another values file here, and it would be in Spanish. So if I look for instance, I think it's ES is Spanish. So I could say ES. So if it's in Spanish, then I'll have another strings.xml file. And it will use that one automatically instead. So I'd have another strings.xml. It's going to put in values ES. And so inside of here, I would have all those same strings as are here, but these would be in Spanish. That's it. So the whole reason that strings XML, you want to extract all those resources into strings XML is because that enables you to translate it into another language. Cool?
Okay, yeah, you mentioned that. I forgot.
Yeah, and that's a really big deal because, it's very common and very likely that your app will be used by people that are not English speakers or will have some value. If you narrow down your market for apps to only people that speak English or only speak whatever your native language is, you're missing a very large portion of the market as far as smartphones are concerned. So that's one thing that matters even more than it does on websites. It really matters for apps to have it be translated into whatever your customer's language is. Okay?
Okay.
So that's a really important thing, which is why it's kind of built in. Okay. So we've got that discussed. I want to go back to the enter name activity now. I want to show you real quickly how you change it to make the up navigation work the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to override on menu options. No. On options item selected. That's the one I want. Okay. So we haven't talked to... Wait, no, this is not the one I want. No. I think that's the one. Is that? Yeah, I think that's it. So we haven't talked about this method yet. We'll talk about it in a later lesson. But basically, this gets called anytime you use the menu up in the right, which is typically a triple dot. The thing is, this function also gets called when you click the up arrow as well, and it gets called with a specific item, menu item, because this is conceptually is a menu item. Now, all I need to do is I need to see if the ID of the item is a certain thing. So int item ID is equal to item dot get item ID. If the ID of that is Android, I believe it's Android.R. Nope. Let me look this back up because it's been a while since I did this. Android menu.
Item IDs are always going to be ints.
Yes. IDs are always ints.
And it's just the order that they're in that 3-dot menu. So it'd be 0, 1, 2, like that.
No, it's not the order. It's an ID. And IDs, you can kind of think of them as auto increment numbers. So it really has to do with the order that it parses through your XMLs. They're not going to be predictable. It's not going to be, you can't just say like the third item is going to be 3. It's probably going to be something completely different.
Okay, I saw that earlier with, I think it's in line 23 and 24 there.
Yeah. How to switch?
No, maybe it's something different. I can't remember, but it was something I thought was going to be a string and end up being an int.
Yeah. Yeah, all of the IDs are integers. And it's been a while. So I know I had it saved somewhere here. And I thought it was Android. It was like android.r.id.home. Yes. I don't know why that didn't come up in IntelliSense, but I'm in the right place. android.r.id.home. That's the value I want. Okay, well now it likes it. It just didn't come up in IntelliSense. So in the case that that one's been pressed, what I want to do is on back pressed, and then return true. Otherwise, we do what the parent class does. Let me run that now and just test that I've got that right. So what is, oh, no, I want to increment the count. Okay, what is your name? Back. There we go. So this is the kind of the magic block of code that you have to put in to make the home button work the same as the back button. This changes a little bit depending on what you're building. So it may be something else if you're working with fragments, which we'll talk about later. But this is generally the way to work around that. So I'll post that in the chat so you can have a copy of that, as well as obviously the code.
We'll always want this in our secondary activities.
Yes, I would recommend putting that in all of your secondary activities.
And so on, like if there was a child activity to enter name activity, do it there too.
Yeah,
it's just
I would do it there.
Something you do.
Yeah, my experience is that just makes your code, that just makes your app work better by making that switch.
So what that's doing is it's making the back and the up button do the same.
Right. So what I'm saying is if the item you clicked on is home, which is that up arrow, if it's that ID, then call on back pressed, which is what gets triggered when you press the back button. And otherwise, and say that it's been handled, return true says it's been handled. Otherwise, we go on to the default behavior.
Okay, but if you have something else nested even further down, away from home, then that won't work.
No, this will still work. This will still work.
But
regardless,
it's up, not home, right?
Up is, so the ID of this is actually home.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, we call it the up button, but internally to Android, the ID of it is home. You're right. This is the up button, and this commonly refer to the circle as the home button. But the way that Android named that, they named it home.
Okay. Probably not the best.
It's
choice,
not the best.
But that's the way it is.
But that's just the way it is. So I would, definitely save that, but I would expect that in all of your activities that are not the main. And even I could even put this in main, and there would be no harm. So I usually end up just putting this in all of my activities. Okay. So that's kind of fixing that button, and I want to now fix the save button so we can send the name back, and then we'll be done here. So in there, I want to get the text that you've typed in. So I might say string name is equal to edit name edit dot get text. Now, if we pay attention here, does everybody see what get text returns? Editable. Okay. What would I expect that to return?
A string.
A string, right? And I'd like it to return a string. But it doesn't. Okay, so it returns editable. All right. So editable is not a string.
It's because strings are not immutable, right? And edibles are. Editable.
That's one part of it. The other part of it is the edit text can actually include formatting information. Like you can have a portion of the text be bold or italic. So this editable that we're getting back actually has formatting information in it as well. Okay. Strings can't have that formatting information. So editable is a subclass of char sequence, but it is not a subclass of string. Okay? It's not a subclass of string. So generally what we do is immediately after we call getText, we're going to call toString to transform it into a string. Okay?
That seems too easy.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's just not getText. It's getText toString. So that's the one catch that you have to remember is say getText and then toString. All right, so that gives us the name, and I can now build up my intent. And so let's say my intent here equals new intent. And I might call this reply intent because this is kind of the one that comes back. So reply intent, and maybe in reply intent, I'm going to say dot put extra. And maybe the name of this is name, and the value is name. So the name as a string is my key, and the name variable is my value. And then finally, I'll say set result. So we're going to say set result, give it the result code. So the result code should be result OK because this worked. And I'm going to add in my intent. So my reply intent there. And then I'm going to finally finish. Okay. So what this will do is when I click save, it'll bundle up the name into this intent and kind of send it back. Now, I still need to change main activity to receive that intent, but I have it being sent back. Okay, so you catch the parts of that idiom that matter: set result and finish. You see that? Everybody see that?
Yeah. Result OK is an int, and the other one is a what?
Is an intent object.
Okay.
Yeah, which I just created here on line 34.
Oh, yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I create that and then pass it back. And so back on main activity, the method I need to override is on activity result. Then I want to say, well, when we get that result back, we want to update this text view down here. So I do need to get that. So private text view name text. And so name text I'll get in here. And name text is equal to find view by ID r.id .name and name text. Now, did I not rename that? I don't think I renamed that. So let me go look at my main activity. Oh, yep, it's still called text view 2. That's why. So this needs to be name text. So name text is there. Now I want to clean up a little bit. So I've got this method that's saying set text here. I've got this code up here, which is getting the count. I'm going to kind of move those lines of code down there. So I'm going to drag this here to kind of clean that up a little bit. Okay, so I've got that there. So when we get the activity result back, we're going to say, well, if the request code is something, right? So in this case, I'm going to just say, well, it's 1. There's a little problem here because I haven't defined this request code yet, but we'll come back to that. And result code is equal to result OK. And so in here, if I do get back a request code 1, result code OK, then I might want to say, well, let's update that text view to show the name that we received. So I might say string name is equal to data, which is the third parameter here. So data dot get extra. Now, one big thing that you'll notice here, I'm asking for the extra within this if statement. Okay, I'm only asking for the extra within the if statement. One of the things that you don't want to do is don't do this. Don't do this outside of the if statement. Okay, don't ask for extras or don't do anything with the intent unless you've already checked that it's okay. Everybody with me on that? The problem is that this can be null. And you might get this method called for other cases. So if you have this here, this will actually crash my program. This will actually crash my program because sometimes data will be null. Or sometimes that extra won't be there. So only ever extract an extra in the specific case where everything's good. Does everybody follow with me?
Yeah, that makes sense. You're trying to avoid a null reference error.
Yeah.
One question I got on line 49 there, request code equals 1.
Mm-hmm.
1. What does that mean? That seems...
We'll come... Yeah,
Okay.
we'll come back to that. I need to fix that. I'll come back to that. Because I haven't defined that number. So I need to grab the name, and when I have the name, I can then say name text dot set text, and we're going to set it to the name we received. So that's what I'd like it to do. The problem is, and the problem with the request code here is that I haven't, when I open the second activity, you see I call start activity. What method do I need to call instead? If I want to get a result back, I can't just call start activity. I have to call start activity for result. Does everybody remember that from the slides?
No.
Okay.
Don't remember it.
So start activity for result. Do remember that. And so in that method, that's where I need to pass in and define what the request code is. So up here, if I say the request code is 1, then it also needs to be request code 1 down here. So I could say, well, this is request code 3, and it would be 3 here, and that would be okay. The number really doesn't matter, but you have to be consistent about the numbering. So in here, I'm going to now go to, let's count up a little bit and go, what's my name? And so I might say my name is Paul Smith, hit save, and it's going to send that name back here.
You'd think that'd be a Boolean instead of an int. I guess there's more than 2 cases.
Well, what's you're talking about the result code?
Request code.
Okay. The request code you can have multiple, you can define as many request codes as you want. So imagine I have 3 different views here that each let you do different things, right? So maybe I have one to say edit name and edit email and edit password, right? Those would be 3 different request codes. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So the request code is tied up with when you asked for it. It's what you sent here. And then you get it back. And result code is the other one that's also an int, but that one's also same case. It's not just true false. Okay, so that's kind of the layout for doing that. Now, one thing I want to fix before we finish here, I have some magic numbers and some magic strings littered throughout my code. Okay, so for instance, this number 3, right? That's a magic number, right?
What do you mean by that? Because you defined it in 42, line 42?
Right. It's on line 42 and line 48, but my code doesn't anywhere say that those need to be the same number. Right? So a lot of these things like this, you want to make them constants. Okay? So we can reuse those constants. So I'm going to go to the top of the class, and we're going to start declaring some of those constants. So I might say, in terms of constants, maybe I'll say public static final, right? So I'm declaring a constant, and that constant's going to be available elsewhere. So for this one, I might say request request name. So request name is 3. So I've just given it a name. Everybody with me on that? So I've given it a constant where I can have that name. So I create that constant. I can now use that constant down here. Request name, request name. So now it's kind of implicit that, it's using a constant there, right? It's using a constant, so I know what that constant represents. It's no longer a magic number. Cool?
Yep.
Okay. Are there any other magic values that I have here? Other things that maybe should be constants?
The string extra.
The extras, right? So I've got a count here, right, that I'm passing around, right? And I've got this name here that I'm also using, right? So I should probably declare both of those as constant. Does that make sense? So up here, I'm going to say public static final, and this is a string, public static final string, and this is extra. I've got the count, which that is count, and I've got the name like so. Right, so I'm going to clear both of those constants, and then I can sub that in. So anywhere here I'm using that count string, I'm going to change that to extra count, and extra count, and then finally down here, extra name. Everybody with me there on kind of declaring constants and using those for your extras?
Yes.
Okay. That's considered good practice. As you saw, my application still runs without it, but it's good practice because it helps you kind of catch some errors before they happen, and it really helps you if you ever need to refactor or change the code. Because the other thing that if you pay really close attention to, notice that those special values are not just here, they're also over here, right? So over here, do you see I have count and I have name as well? See that?
When you can get to them because you declared them in the parent activity. Or
I could. Yeah, so I could, over here, I could get to them as well. Main activity, as I could say main activity dot extra count. And down here I could say main activity dot extra name. Okay, and I could do that, and again, my code works. The problem is now, right? enter name activity knows about main activity. Do you see that? There's a link now between enter name activity and main activity. Do you see that? I don't want that, right? Remember in the slides I said that these activities should be loosely coupled. Should be loosely coupled, right? So does enter name activity have any reason to need to know about main activity? Does it really care how you got there? No, it doesn't, right? So I'd rather not have it refer to those extras. Do you see that? I'd rather not have it refer to those constants that are over in main activity. So rather than doing that, let me just say, first of all, what happens if I just add the constants in both places? All right, that works, right? So I can declare the constants in both places, and now they don't depend on each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but aren't you duplicating code there and holding more space in memory?
I am duplicating code. And one of the things you might want to pay attention to here is, let's say I call this count2 and name2. Okay, everybody with me? So I've got count and name, count2 and count2 and name2. Everybody following with me?
Why would you do that? I'm
just going to show you the problem, right? So here's the problem. So let's say I go to try this now. And I'm going to say, let's count to 2, right? So if I hit what is your name, what should the next screen say? It should say 2, right? It doesn't. Okay, so when I'm passing data to this screen, right, where does this count2 get used? Where does count2 get used?
Line 29.
Line 29.
Set the value.
Right. So 29 uses that to pull it from the intent that we received. Does that make sense? It's the data that we received. So in reality, it's receiving it, right? The main activity is sending it as count, but then we're looking at it for it in count2. Does that make sense? So it's not seeing it. So in terms of, where we put the constants, where you put the constants really does matter. And I would really stress, don't litter them across your code and just put them in random places. I will say that this code lab, the with 2.1, doesn't do a good job of putting the constants in the right classes. Okay, it doesn't do a good job of giving you good guidance on that. So if I think about, who really owns both of these, I'd really rather like this to not refer to main activity at all. So rather than having, I want to have these constants both here because I need them there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to here, and I say, well, when I want to enter name activity, I won't use my constant, I'll use their constant. So enter name activity dot extra count. And when I want to read the name that comes back, I'm going to use the constant over there. So sometimes it matters where you put the constant. Yes, Paul, you're right. You shouldn't have the same constant multiple times. Okay. But where you put the constant matters is what I'm trying to get to.
Is that the best practice, to put it in the child or the secondary activity and then pull it up from the main activity?
I would generally put it in the child. I would declare my constants in the child activity instead of declaring them in the parent activity wherever I can. So what that means is, let's say now I've removed the reference here, so extra name only exists over there. I've got kind of a problem of extra count because, well, I'm kind of using it actually for two different purposes. I'm using the extra to send the count to this enter name activity, but I'm also using it to send it to myself. But I think in this case, I'm just going to go, let's say, well, we'll remove the constants in both cases, in there and there, and we'll just have it in the child. So I think in here it makes a lot more sense to have the constants declared over there for those values. Because effectively this is kind of where it's receiving it. It's receiving it extra count and then sending the return value in extra name. Does that make sense? So you really want to avoid declaring a whole bunch of constants in main activity. That's what usually people end up doing, is they end up declaring all of their constants in main activity. And then the rest of your code depends now on main activity, which is kind of a problem. Okay? Any questions so far with this at all? I think I'm done.
Yeah, you'll add this to your GitHub, right? We'll be able to pull that down into the new repo.
Up here a second, and I'll get you a copy of it.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, I think for me it's just gonna take a little bit of time to like think about it going like backwards like that.
What do you mean going backwards?
Well, like pulling the enter name rather than the main.
Yeah. It'll take a little bit kind of thinking about how to do that. But the thing I would the thing I stress there is to just use, usually the right place to put it is in the child activity, rather than putting it up in the parent.
This example is a little more complicated than the code lab. The code lab's more designed to kind of like hold our hand step by step to get through it.
It's designed to hold your hand and get you step by step through it. But if you look at what we've done today, it's actually almost identical to the code lab.
Okay.
So,
and you said we have tomorrow to work on the code lab as well.
Yep. You'll have tomorrow to work on the code lab as well.
Okay. So it doesn't have to be done tonight.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be done today. So remember, tomorrow I do want to meet with everybody, talking about a few different things, and part of that is just meeting with you, looking at your Unit 0 labs. So recognize that we're going to have some time set aside to do that. But yeah, you have today and tomorrow to work on those.
Is there a time frame for today's attendance?
Time frame for today's attendance? Really turn it in anytime. Let me go ahead and see who all is here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Everybody's here. I'll mark everybody present either way, because I can see everybody in Discord. So we ran long.
Sweet.
Cool.
Everybody's here. I'll mark them present. So, as far as the code lab is concerned, let me pull that up. So we're looking at 2.1. It'll walk through all the specific steps. For this code lab, you don't need to do the coding challenge. You can skip the coding challenge. So write that down. You can skip the coding challenge for this one. Sometimes I'll ask you to do that, and we have done that in the past. But I don't need you to do the coding challenge for this. What I do want you to do, however, is the homework assignment. So there's another, once you finish the tasks, there is a program here that they ask you to build for the homework. I do want you to do that project. Okay?
Is that also available to work on tomorrow?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll work on that tomorrow as well. So the tasks and then the homework is what you want to do tomorrow. Cool?
Yeah. Sounds good.
Okay.
we good to go now, or?
You're good to go. I'll post up a link here to